Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back 2,500 years to witness one of history's most incredible David versus Goliath stories. Imagine standing at a narrow mountain pass watching an army so massive it drank rivers dry as it marched. An empire that controlled everything from India to the Mediterranean Sea, bringing its full wrath against 300 warriors who refused to kneel. This is the story of Thermopylae, where courage faced impossible odds and where the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread. What happened in those 3 days would echo through history forever. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, but only if the story truly resonates with you tonight. And hey, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom. Maybe you're winding down after a long day. Drop a comment and let me know. Now dim those lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on that fan for some gentle white noise, and let's travel back to 480 BC together. Picture this. It's the year 486 BC, and the most powerful man on earth has just died. His name was Darius of Persia. And when I say powerful, I mean he ruled an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Achaemenid. Persian Empire wasn't just big, it was colossal. We're talking about a domain that stretched from the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan all the way to the shores of Libya and Egypt, from the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus Mountains down to the burning deserts of Ethiopia. Think about that for a moment. If you started walking from one end of the Persian Empire to the other, you'd cross through 46 different nations. 46, each with their own languages, their own gods, their own cultures, all bowing to one throne in Persepolis. The Persians controlled the world's most important trade routes, the richest cities, the most fertile lands. They had gold flowing from Lydia, skilled craftsmen from Phoenicia, fierce warriors from Media, and the wisdom of Babylon's scholars at their fingertips. This wasn't just an empire. This was the superpower of the ancient world. And when Darius died, his throne passed to his son, a man named Xerxes. Now, Xerxes wasn't supposed to be king. He was actually the fourth son of Darius. But his mother Atossa was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the legendary founder of the Persian Empire. Her bloodline gave Xerxes the legitimacy he needed. And when his older brothers conveniently disappeared from the succession line, 30-year-old Xerxes found himself sitting on the most powerful throne in the world. Here's where it gets interesting. Xerxes inherited more than just an empire from his father. He inherited an obsession. You see, 10 years earlier in 490 BC, Darius had sent a massive invasion force across the Aegean Sea to punish two Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, for daring to support a rebellion against Persian rule. That army landed at a place called Marathon, about 26 miles from Athens, and something shocking happened, something that should have been impossible. The Athenians, heavily outnumbered without their Spartan allies who arrived too late, somehow defeated the Persian army. They killed around 6,400 Persian soldiers, while losing only 192 of their own. The Persians had to retreat in complete humiliation. For an empire that had never known defeat, this was unthinkable. It was like a heavyweight champion getting knocked out by a featherweight. Darius was furious. Ancient sources tell us he ordered a servant to whisper in his ear 3 times before every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." He immediately began planning an even larger invasion. But fate had other plans. In 486 BC, before he could exact his revenge, Darius died. His unfinished business fell to his son. Now here's what you need to understand about Xerxes. Modern movies and stories often paint him as arrogant and foolish, but that's not quite fair. Xerxes was actually a capable administrator and a shrewd leader. When he took the throne, the first thing he did wasn't rush into war. No, he spent his first 2 years crushing rebellions in Egypt and Babylon provinces that had gotten a bit too comfortable during the transition of power. Only when his empire was stable and secure did he turn his attention to Greece. And when he did, he didn't just want to win. He wanted to make a statement that would resound through history. Starting in 484 BC, Xerxes began preparations that were absolutely mind-blowing in their scale and ambition. Remember, this was 2,500 years ago. No engines, no modern tools, no technology. Everything was done with human and animal labor. And what Xerxes ordered was nothing short of miraculous engineering. First, he commanded that a canal be dug across the peninsula of Mount Athos. Why? Because 12 years earlier, a Persian fleet had been destroyed in a storm while trying to sail around that peninsula. Xerxes wasn't about to let the same thing happen to his ships, so he ordered his engineers to dig a canal wide enough for 2 warships to pass through side by side. Ancient historians tell us that 120,000 workers labored for 3 years to complete this project. When it was finished, it was over a mile long and deep enough for warships. Let that sink in. They carved a canal through a peninsula with Bronze Age tools, but that was just the warm-up act. Next came perhaps the most audacious engineering feat of the ancient world, bridging the Hellespont. The Hellespont, known today as the Dardanelles, is the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. It's about a mile wide at its narrowest point, with strong currents and unpredictable weather. Xerxes needed to get his massive army across, and ferrying wouldn't cut it. So he ordered the construction of 2 pontoon bridges. Here's how it worked. First, they anchored hundreds of ships, pentaconters and triremes, in a line across the strait. Then they laid wooden planks across the ships to create a roadway. On top of that, they added a layer of brushwood and earth. The whole thing was held together with flaxen and papyrus cables, each one thicker than a man's torso. The first attempt failed spectacularly. A storm destroyed the bridges before they could be used, and Xerxes, well, he did something that tells you everything about the Persian view of kingship. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Xerxes was so enraged that he ordered the Hellespont itself to be punished. His soldiers gave the water 300 lashes with whips and threw a pair of fetters into the sea, essentially imprisoning the waves themselves. Now, modern historians debate whether this really happened, or if it was Greek propaganda to make Xerxes look foolish. But either way, it captures something important: the sheer audacity of what Xerxes was attempting. He was literally trying to bend nature to his will. The second attempt at building the bridges succeeded, and when they were complete, they were strong enough to hold the weight of the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. But we haven't talked about the army yet. Oh boy, the army. Herodotus, our main source for these events, claims that Xerxes assembled a force of 5 million soldiers. 5 million. He describes how, when the army stopped to drink from rivers, the waters ran dry, how the march of soldiers took 7 days and 7 nights of continuous movement just for everyone to cross the bridges. Now here's where we need to pause and talk reality. Modern historians are pretty sure Herodotus was, let's say, being generous with his numbers. 5 million is logistically impossible for the ancient world. You couldn't feed that many people. The supply lines would collapse. The sheer mass of humanity would create chaos. So what was the real number? Well, scholars have debated this for centuries. Conservative estimates put the Persian army at around 100,000 to 200,000, fighting men plus support staff. Some go as high as 300,000 to 500,000 when you include naval forces and non-combatants. Even at the lower end, we're talking about the largest invasion force assembled up to that point in history. To put it in perspective, when the Allies landed at Normandy on D-Day in 1944, one of the largest military operations in modern history, they put about 156,000 troops on the beaches in the first day. Xerxes was moving a comparable force across a pontoon bridge with Bronze Age logistics. The planning, the coordination, the sheer will required. It's staggering. And this wasn't just Persians. Oh no. Xerxes called upon every corner of his empire. From the mountains came fierce warriors from Media and Bactria. From the deserts came cavalry from Arabia. The Phoenicians provided warships and sailors the best in the world. Egyptians, Indians, Ethiopians, Thracians, Armenians, 46 nations marching under one banner. They spoke different languages. They worshipped different gods. They fought with different weapons and different tactics. But Xerxes molded them into a unified war machine. He organized them into divisions, appointed commanders, created supply chains, and established a clear chain of command. The Persian fleet was equally impressive. Ancient sources claim 207 warships, though again, modern estimates are more conservative, probably somewhere between 600 and 800 triremes. These were the aircraft carriers of the ancient world, 3-banked warships powered by 170 rowers, with bronze rams at the front designed to punch holes in enemy ships. Each one could carry about 30 marines for boarding actions. Before the army even left Asia, Xerxes had been preparing for 4 years. He established 5 massive supply depots along the invasion route. At places like White Headland, Doriscos, and Therm, his quartermasters stockpiled grain-dried meat, wine, and water. Local populations were ordered to grind wheat into flour months in advance. Animals were purchased and fattened. Everything was planned with meticulous detail. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a punitive expedition. This was a full-scale invasion designed to conquer and occupy. Xerxes wasn't just coming to defeat Greece. He He was coming to absorb it into his empire permanently, and he had every reason to be confident. After all, what could stop him? The Greeks were fragmented, constantly fighting among themselves. Their cities were tiny compared to Persian might. They had no unified command, no standing army, no empire to draw upon. While Persia could field hundreds of thousands, the largest Greek city-state could maybe muster 10,000 hoplites. In the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes sat on his throne at Sardis in what's now Turkey and surveyed his assembled forces. Imagine that scene, the plain filled with soldiers as far as the eye could see, the banners of 46 nations snapping in the wind, the thunder of thousands of horses, the glint of sunlight on bronze spears and shields. Xerxes sent heralds throughout Greece demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission. Most cities complied. Who wouldn't? To resist meant destruction. But two cities gave a different answer. Athens and Sparta sent messages that were clear and unambiguous. Come and take it by force. The greatest military machine in the world began its march. They crossed the pontoon bridges which, according to Herodotus, took 7 days and 7 nights of continuous movement. Can you picture it? A living river of humanity flowing from Asia into Europe, each soldier taking his turn on those wooden planks suspended over the churning water. From there they marched through Thrace and Macedonia. Kings and cities fell over themselves to submit. The northern Greek states, seeing the overwhelming force, chose survival over resistance. By the time Xerxes reached Thessaly, he had added even more troops to his army from conquered territories. As the Persian juggernaut moved south, Greek spies reported back with terrifying news. The description seemed almost mythological. An army that blackened the plains, a fleet that covered the sea horizon to horizon. The King of Kings, travelling in luxury, carried in a golden chariot protected by his elite guard, the 10,000 immortals, so named because their ranks were immediately refilled whenever someone fell. Back in southern Greece, the mood was grim. Most people believed resistance was futile. The oracle at Delphi, the most sacred site in Greece, where the gods supposedly spoke through their priestess, gave prophecies of doom. When Athens asked what they should do, the oracle told them to flee to the ends of the earth. Not exactly encouraging, but here's what's remarkable. Despite the fear, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the fact that submission would mean survival and wealth, while resistance meant probable death, 2 city-states refused to bow. Athens with its new democracy and its fleet, and Sparta with its warrior culture and its unbreakable code. These 2 cities, often rivals, put aside their differences and became the core of Greek resistance. They sent messengers throughout Greece calling for a united defense. About 31 city-states answered the call, forming something unprecedented, the Hellenic League, a unified Greek alliance. But here's the thing. Even united, they were hopelessly outnumbered. Even if every single allied city sent every single available soldier, they'd be facing odds of 10 to 1 or worse. They couldn't win a pitched battle on open ground. They couldn't match the Persian fleet in numbers. They couldn't outspend or outsupply an empire. They needed something else. They needed a miracle, or at the very least they needed a plan so audacious, so brilliant, that it could give them a fighting chance. That plan would center on a narrow mountain pass in central Greece, a place where the road between the mountains and the sea narrowed to just a few dozen feet, a place where geography could become a weapon, a place with an appropriate name for what was about to unfold, a place called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. But before we get to that legendary battle, before we meet the 300 Spartans and their king, we need to understand what made them so special. Why were the Spartans different from every other Greek soldier? What forged them into the most feared warriors in the ancient world? The answer lies in a system so brutal, so extreme, that even other Greeks found it shocking. A training program that began when boys were just 7 years old and didn't end until they were 30. A culture that valued death over dishonor and collective success over individual survival. Next time we're going into the heart of Sparta itself, to witness the agoge, the most intense military training program the world has ever known. We'll walk through the education of a Spartan boy from his first day away from home to the moment he earns his shield and becomes a citizen warrior. We'll discover what made these men willing to stand against impossible odds without flinching. Because to understand why 300 Spartans chose to face certain death at Thermopylae, you first need to understand what Sparta did to create them. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next part of our journey. So we've seen the empire that was coming, this unstoppable Persian war machine rolling toward Greece like a tidal wave. But now let's talk about the warriors who would dare to stand in its way. And to understand them, we need to go to a place that was unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. A place where childhood ended at age 7, where weakness meant death, and where the state owned your body and soul. Welcome to Sparta. Here's a question for you. What would you do if someone knocked on your door when your son turned 7 and said, "He's ours now"? No negotiation, no exceptions, just goodbye. That's exactly what happened in Sparta. And it wasn't a punishment, it was an honour. The Spartans called their education system the agoge, pronounced agoge, and calling it an education system is like calling a hurricane a gentle breeze. This was systematic conditioning that turned boys into living weapons. It was so extreme, so brutal, that even other Greeks who weren't exactly soft themselves looked at Sparta and thought, you guys might be taking this a bit too far. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked, because it's honestly mind-blowing. You're a Spartan boy. For the first 7 years of your life, you live with your family. Your mother raises you, teaches you the basics, tells you stories of Spartan heroes. But she also prepares you for what's coming. She knows that on your 7th birthday, everything changes. Now here's something important. This didn't apply to everyone. The 2 hereditary kings of Sparta, their eldest sons were exempt. Why? Because the state couldn't risk losing future kings to the brutality of the agoge. But younger princes like Leonidas, the hero of our story, they went through it all. No special treatment, no shortcuts. If you wanted to be a Spartan citizen, if you wanted to be called a Spartiate, you had to earn it. So picture this. You're 7 years old. Men come to your house, state officials called paidonomos, which literally means boy herders. Yeah, that's what they called them. They take you away from your mother. No tears allowed, by the way. Crying was for the weak. Your mother looks at you with pride, not sadness, and says something that would become the most famous Spartan mother's blessing: come back with your shield or on it. Think about that for a second. Either come home victorious or come home dead. Those were the only 2 acceptable options being captured. Retreating without your shield, that was worse than death. That was shame. And in Sparta, shame was the ultimate punishment. You're taken to the barracks, the agela. This is where you'll live for the next 13 years. 13 years. You're grouped with other boys your age, maybe 20 or 30 of them, and placed under the supervision of an older youth, usually around 20 years old. This isn't summer camp. This is survival training disguised as education. The Spartans divided the agoge into 3 stages, and each one got progressively more intense. First came the paid stage from ages 7 to 14. This is where they broke you down, and I mean that literally. The first thing they did was teach you that comfort was your enemy. You want a soft bed? Too bad. You sleep on rushes, basically reeds that you have to gather yourself from the riverbank. With your bare hands, no tools, and if you wanted them softer, you could weave them, but most boys were too exhausted to bother. Clothes. You get 1 cloak, 1. It's called a phoinikis, a rough red garment, that's it. Summer-winter doesn't matter. Greece gets cold, by the way. Real cold, snow in the mountains, freezing rain. Doesn't matter. 1 cloak. Food. Here's where it gets interesting. They gave you just enough to survive. Not enough to thrive, just enough so you wouldn't die. Why? Because they wanted you hungry. Literally starving. And then they did something that seems contradictory. They encouraged you to steal food. Wait, what? Yeah, you heard that right. Stealing was part of the curriculum. But here's the catch. If you got caught, you'd be beaten. Severely. With whips. Now this seems crazy, right? They want you to steal but punish you if you're caught. But there's actually a twisted logic to it. They weren't teaching you it was okay to steal. They were teaching you stealth, cunning, and resourcefulness. In war, you might need to steal supplies from the enemy. You might need to infiltrate their camp. But if you're clumsy enough to get caught, you deserve the consequences. The Greek writer Plutarch tells us about one boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When questioned by his teachers, the fox started gnawing at his stomach. Rather than admit what he'd done, rather than show weakness, the boy stood there silently, while the fox literally ate through his flesh. He died from his injuries without making a sound. Now, historians debate whether this story is true or just propaganda. But true or not, it tells us what Spartans valued: endurance over everything, silence in the face of pain, never ever showing weakness. And speaking of pain, let me tell you about the festivals. Once a year, Sparta held a ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys would try to steal cheeses from the altar while older men whipped them. This wasn't secret or shameful, this was a public spectacle. Families came to watch. The goal. See how much pain you could endure without crying out. Boys competed to see who could take the most lashes. Some died from it. That was considered an honourable death. The historian Paul Cartledge, one of the leading experts on Sparta, called this a trial by ordeal, and you know what? That's putting it mildly. But it wasn't just physical conditioning. The agog also included intellectual training, just not the kind you might expect. You learned to read and write, but only the basics. None of that fancy Athenian poetry or philosophy. You studied military tactics, strategy and geography. You learned about past battles and legendary Spartan warriors. You also learned something called laconophrasia, the art of speaking briefly and sharply. You know the word laconic, meaning using few words, that comes from Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. Spartans didn't waste words. When King Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, sent a message to Sparta saying, "If I invade Laconia, I will destroy Sparta," the Spartans sent back a one-word reply, "If." That's it, just if. Philip never invaded. This wasn't just about being tough or cool. Excessive talking was seen as weak. In battle, orders needed to be clear and instant. There was no time for speeches or debate. Say what you mean what you say, and shut up. That was the Spartan way. Now music and dance were part of the agog too, but again not like you'd think. You didn't learn to play the lyre for entertainment. You learned war songs, paeans that soldiers would sing while marching into battle. You learned synchronized dances that mimicked battle formations. Everything, absolutely everything, had a military purpose. Around age 12, things intensified. You graduated from paids to being a youth. Now you trained barefoot. Always. Summer, winter, rocky terrain, thorns didn't matter. Walk barefoot. Why? Because it toughened your feet. Sure, but it also improved your balance, your agility, your connection to the ground. Modern science has actually proven this going. Barefoot develops better proprioception and athletic ability. The Spartans figured this out 2,500 years ago. The beatings became more frequent, the challenges harder. They'd wake you up in the middle of the night for forced marches, send you into the mountains with no supplies, make you fight other boys, not play fighting, real fighting. Broken noses, lost teeth, fractured bones. You learn to take damage and keep going. But here's something that often gets left out of the Spartan story. This system created deep bonds between the boys. You suffered together, bled together, starved together. The boy standing next to you wasn't just a classmate, he was your brother in the truest sense. You'd die for him, and he'd die for you. This wasn't just rhetoric. This was beaten into your bones. There was also a mentorship system that modern readers find uncomfortable. Older warriors would take younger boys under their wing in relationships that were both educational and, by our standards, inappropriate. Ancient sources describe these as Orestes, the older mentor, and Erymenes, the younger student. The philosopher Xenophon insists these relationships weren't sexual, while other sources suggest they were. Historians still debate this. What's undeniable is that these partnerships served a military function. The younger boy learned from an experienced warrior. The older warrior gained a devoted follower who would fight twice as hard to impress him. On the battlefield, you fought near your mentor or student, creating an extra layer of loyalty and motivation. At age 15, you entered the paidiskoi stage. Now the physical training became intense. We're talking wrestling, boxing, javelin, throwing discus, running hours every day. You practiced with weapons, the Xephus short sword, and especially the dory, the 7 to 9 foot spear that was Hoplite's primary weapon. And here's something fascinating. You trained in formation, always in formation. The phalanx wasn't just a battle tactic, it was a way of life. You learned to move as one organism. Your shield didn't just protect you, it protected the man to your left. His shield protected you. If you broke formation, you died. If your neighbour broke formation, you died. Trust was everything. Coordination was everything. You also learned what we might call psychological warfare. How to project confidence. How to move with purpose. How to make your enemy fear you before the fighting even started. Spartans would march into battle slowly, calmly, singing their war songs in perfect unison. Other Greeks would charge with wild screams, not Spartans. They walked to their deaths with the same casual confidence as walking to dinner. The historian Thucydides wrote about a Spartan army preparing for battle. They advanced slowly into the music of many flute players in their ranks. This custom was not instituted for religious reasons, but to enable them to advance evenly and not break ranks, which often happens with large armies when they go into battle. Think about that. While their enemies were panicking, screaming, hyping themselves up with adrenaline, the Spartans were literally listening to flute music and keeping perfect formation. That's a different level of discipline. Around age 20 if you survived, and not everyone did. Some boys died in training. You became a hebont. You were almost a full citizen, but not quite. You'd join a session, a communal mess hall where adult Spartans ate together every night. To get in, you needed to be voted in by the existing members. If even one man voted against you, you were rejected. This was your final test. Had you earned the respect of other warriors? If you passed, you became a full Spartan citizen. You could marry, own property, vote in the assembly, but your military service, that was just beginning. You were in the army until age 60. 60. The average life expectancy in ancient Greece was maybe 45. Spartans expected you to be ready to fight until you literally couldn't anymore. Now let's talk about what all this created, because the product of the Agog wasn't just a soldier, it was something different, something that frightened other Greeks as much as it impressed them. Spartan warriors were famous for their ability to endure pain without flinching, to face death without fear, to maintain discipline when other armies would break and run. At the Battle of Marathon, 10 years before our story, the Athenians, brave men, heroes in their own right, charged the Persians while shouting and screaming. When a small Spartan contingent finally arrived after the battle, the Athenians marvelled at how calm they were, how disappointed they seemed to have missed the fighting. A Spartan warrior feared shame more than death. Let me say that again. Shame was worse than dying. If you retreated, if you showed cowardice, you were marked for life. You'd be called a tresance, a trembler. You couldn't hold office. Nobody would marry you or do business with you. You were a ghost in your own city. Death was preferable. This mindset created warriors who would hold their ground in situations where any rational person would run. Where survival instinct would scream at you to flee, Spartan conditioning screamed louder. Stand. Your ground. But here's the dark side that often gets glossed over. This system was built on slavery. Sparta's economy ran on the backs of the Helots, a subjugated population that outnumbered Spartans 7-1. While Spartan men trained for war Helots, farmed the land and did all the actual work, and the Spartans kept them in line through terror. Young Spartans in training would sometimes hunt Helots at night, the Cryptia killing them, to keep the population frightened and submissive. This wasn't ancient propaganda or enemy accusations. Spartans openly admitted to this. It was policy. And it's part of why, when we talk about Spartan equality, we need asterisks everywhere. Yes, all Spartans were equal, but only if you were a male Spartiate who'd survived the Agog and weren't a Helot slave or a Perikoi second-class citizen. The system was also incredibly rigid. That same discipline that made Spartans unstoppable in traditional warfare made them terrible at adaptation. When warfare evolved, when new tactics emerged, Spartans struggled to adjust. The historian Stephen Hodkinson notes that the stability the Agoge fostered also led to a certain inflexibility. When you've spent your entire life learning one way to fight, one way to think, changing becomes almost impossible. But in 480 BC, none of these weaknesses had been exposed yet. In 480 BC, Sparta was at the height of its power and prestige. Spartan warriors were considered the best infantry in the Greek world, unbeatable, unstoppable. When other city-states went to war, they hoped Sparta would fight alongside them. When Sparta went to war, others hoped not to be the target, and in 480 BC, when Xerxes sent his heralds demanding earth and water, when he asked Sparta to submit to Persian rule, he was asking the one society in Greece that was literally bred to never ever kneel. Now every society creates myths about itself, right? Americans talk about rugged individualism. Romans believed they were destined to rule. The British had their stiff upper lip. Sparta's national myth was simple. We do not retreat. We do not surrender. We do not break. Most societies can't live up to their myths when push comes to shove. Sparta was about to prove whether theirs was real or just marketing, because when the Persian army came south, when Xerxes led his hundreds of thousands toward Greek territory, someone needed to buy time. Someone needed to slow that massive army down long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare. Someone needed to stand at a narrow pass and tell the largest empire in the world no further. That someone would be a Spartan king named Leonidas. And to understand why he made the choice he did at Thermopylae, why 300 men followed him willingly to certain death, you need to understand where he came from. Not just Sparta, but the man himself. Because Leonidas wasn't supposed to be king. He was a younger son, which meant he went through every brutal day of the agoge. He knew what it meant to be broken down and rebuilt. He'd stolen food while starving, been whipped at festivals, slept on reed beds in winter, fought and bled and suffered alongside the men he would one day lead into battle. Next, we're going to meet Leonidas, the unlikely king who would become a legend. We'll trace his journey from a boy in the agoge to the leader of Sparta. We'll discover the man behind the myth, and we'll see why, when prophecy and duty called, he chose death with honor over life with shame. The pieces are moving into place. Persia is marching. Sparta has its warriors. Now we need the leader who will bring them all to the hot gates. Let's keep going. You know what's interesting about heroes? We always assume they were destined for greatness from birth. Born with a crown on their head marked by the gods, raised in luxury, knowing they'd one day rule. But the most compelling leaders, the ones who truly inspire, are often the ones who never expected the throne at all. Leonidas was one of those men. Around 540 BC, though some historians suggest it might have been a few years later, a baby was born in Sparta into the Aegean dynasty, one of Sparta's two royal families. His name meant lion-like, or son of the lion, which sounds pretty epic, right? Destined for greatness, surely. Except there was a problem. Actually, several problems. He had older brothers. In the line of succession, he was basically an afterthought, a spare to the spare. The Aegean throne would go to his eldest brother Dorius. If something happened to Dorius, there was Cleomenes. And if both of them somehow fell well, then maybe they'd consider Leonidas. But here's what made Leonidas different from every other prince in the ancient world. He wasn't exempt from the agoge. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the eldest sons of the two royal families got a pass on the brutal training? They were too valuable, too important to risk. Well, that exemption only applied to the direct heir, younger princes. They went through everything. Every beating, every cold night, every moment of starvation and pain. Leonidas experienced it all. Can you imagine that you're royalty? You could theoretically trace your lineage back to Heracles, yeah. The Heracles, the legendary demigod. Your family claims descent from Zeus himself. And yet at age 7, you're ripped from your home just like every other Spartan boy, treated exactly the same, given no special privileges whatsoever. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was Sparta ensuring that even its princes understood what every citizen warrior endured. If you were going to lead Spartan soldiers one day, you needed to have bled beside them, starved beside them, suffered beside them. Leadership through shared hardship. It's brilliant when you think about it. So young Leonidas entered the agoge around 533 BC. For the next 13 years, he lived the life we just described, sleeping on reed beds, wearing one thin cloak through winter, stealing food to survive, taking lashes at the altar, learning to fight to endure, to never show weakness. But something happened during those years that nobody expected. His older brother Dorius, the one who was supposed to inherit the throne, decided he didn't want to wait around. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Dorius was proud, ambitious, and this is key. He couldn't stand the idea of serving under his half-brother Cleomenes, who had become king instead due to maternal lineage politics. So around 520 BC, Dorius did something almost unheard of. He left Sparta. Just packed up, took a group of followers, and went off to found his own colony in North Africa. That venture failed spectacularly. Then he tried again in Sicily. That one also ended badly, with Dorius dead in battle around 510 BC. Suddenly, Leonidas went from being the forgotten prince to the heir apparent. Now, Cleomenes was king, ruling from around 520 to 490 BC, and by all accounts, he was complicated. Brilliant military mind, fierce warrior, but also possibly insane. Ancient sources describe him as paranoid, violent, and erratic. The Athenian historian Herodotus tells a story about Cleomenes going mad later in life, attacking random citizens with his staff until his own family imprisoned him. He allegedly died by suicide in prison, though some modern historians suspect assassination. During Cleomenes' reign, Leonidas would have been in his 20s and 30s, serving as a warrior, attending the assembly, participating in the Syssitia, those communal messes we talked about. He wasn't sitting around in a palace. He was living the Spartan life, fully fighting in battles, building relationships with the men who would one day serve under him. And here's something fascinating. He married Cleomenes' daughter, Gorgo. Now, Gorgo is worth talking about because she was absolutely remarkable for her time, or really for any time. Ancient sources describe her as intelligent, politically savvy, and completely unafraid to speak her mind in a male-dominated society. Plutarch tells a story about Gorgo when she was just 8 or 9 years old. A Persian diplomat came to Sparta trying to bribe Cleomenes. Young Gorgo watched this exchange and then spoke up, which, by the way, children typically didn't do in the presence of kings and diplomats. She said to her father, "Father, you'd better leave or this stranger will corrupt you." Cleomenes took her advice and dismissed the Persian. An 8-year-old girl just shut down a diplomatic bribery attempt. That's the woman Leonidas married. Later, when another woman reportedly asked Gorgo, "Why are Spartan women the only women in the world who rule over men?" Gorgo's response was perfect. "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." Savage. Absolutely savage. This tells us something important about Leonidas. He chose a partner who was his intellectual equal, someone who could advise him, challenge him, think strategically. That's not something every ancient leader valued. Many saw wives as property or political pawns. Leonidas saw Gorgo as a partner. When Cleomenes died in 490 BC, the same year as the Battle of Marathon, remember, Leonidas became king. He was probably around 50 years old. 50. Most men in ancient Greece were past their physical prime by then. But remember, Spartans trained until 60. Leonidas was still in fighting condition, still capable of standing in a phalanx and holding a shield for hours. But becoming king of Sparta wasn't like becoming king of other Greek city-states, and it definitely wasn't like being Xerxes, the king of kings. Sparta had a unique dual kingship system, 2 kings from 2 different families ruling simultaneously. When Leonidas took the Aegeid throne, he ruled alongside Leotychidas II of the Eurypontid family. And honestly, the Spartan kings didn't have that much power. Shocking, right? You'd think king equals absolute power, but not in Sparta. The real power lay with the Ephors 5 annually elected magistrates who could overrule the kings. There was also the Gerousia, a council of 28 elders, plus the 2 kings who handled most major decisions. And the Apella, the assembly of all Spartan citizens who could vote on laws and policies. The king's primary role was military. You commanded the army in wartime, you performed religious ceremonies, you had certain judicial powers, but you couldn't just do whatever you wanted. If the Ephors thought you were out of line, they could prosecute you, fine you, even exile you. Spartan kings served the state. The state didn't serve them. This meant Leonidas was a leader who had to earn respect, not demand it. He couldn't rule through fear or decree. He led through example, through shared hardship, through proving himself worthy again and again. For 10 years, from 490 to 480 BC, Leonidas ruled during a period of increasing tension. Everyone knew the Persians would come back. Darius had been planning his revenge before he died. Now Xerxes was continuing that mission on an even grander scale. Sparta prepared, they trained, they watched, they waited. And then in 481 BC, Xerxes sent his heralds throughout Greece demanding earth and water, the symbols of submission. Most cities complied. The smart move, the safe move, was to submit. Why throw your life away fighting an empire you couldn't possibly defeat? But Athens and Sparta gave different answers. The story goes, and this might be legend, but it captures the spirit perfectly, that when the Persian heralds reached Sparta and made their demand, the Spartans threw them into a well and told them, "If you want earth and water, dig for it down there." This was a massive insult, by the way. Killing heralds was sacrilege in the ancient world. They were supposed to be protected by the gods. You just didn't do that. But Spartans didn't care. They'd already thrown Persian heralds into a pit 10 years earlier during Darius's invasion. They weren't about to start bowing now. In late 481, BC representatives from about 31 Greek city-states met at Corinth to form the Hellenic League. This was unprecedented. Greeks didn't unify. They fought each other constantly. Athens and Sparta had been rivals for decades. But now facing existential threat, they put aside their differences and chose Sparta to lead the military forces. Why Sparta? Because when it came to land warfare, everyone knew Spartans were the best. If you needed someone to hold a line against impossible odds, you wanted Spartans at the front. Their reputation alone was worth thousands of soldiers. But here's the challenge: Leonidas faced resources. Sparta's army wasn't huge. The Spartiates' full citizen warriors numbered maybe 8,000 to 10,000 at most. And they couldn't all leave Sparta at once because of the helot problem we discussed. If all the warriors left, the enslaved population might revolt. It was a constant balancing act. Plus there was a religious issue. In late summer of 480 BC, when the Persian army was marching south, Sparta was celebrating the Carnia, a religious festival honoring Apollo. During this festival, Spartans weren't supposed to march to war. It was sacred law. Similarly, the Olympic Games were being held, and many Greeks believed it was sacrilege to fight during the Games. The gods had to be honored first. Warfare could wait. Except warfare couldn't wait. Xerxes wasn't going to pause his invasion for Greek religious festivals. The Persian army was coming, and it was coming now. So Leonidas faced an impossible situation. He couldn't take the full Spartan army due to religious restrictions and the Helot threat. But the Greeks needed Sparta to make a stand to show that resistance was possible to buy time for the other city-states to mobilize fully. The plan that emerged was strategic brilliance born of desperation. There was a narrow pass in central Greece called Thermopylae, where the mountains came down to meet the sea, creating a natural choke point. If you could hold that pass, you could stop an army of any size. Geography would become the great equalizer. The strategy was actually twofold: hold Thermopylae on land, while the Greek fleet held the strait at Artemisium at sea. If the Persians couldn't advance on land and their fleet couldn't support them from the sea, the invasion would stall. And if it stalled long enough, maybe winter would come and force Xerxes to retreat. Maybe the fragile Persian alliance would fracture. Maybe something would happen to save Greece. It was a long shot. But it was the only shot they had. Leonidas was chosen to lead the advance force. He would take his 300-man royal guard, the Hippais, the elite bodyguard that every Spartan king commanded. These weren't just any warriors. These were the best of the best chosen for their skill, courage, and absolute loyalty. Every one of them was over 30 years old, meaning they were experienced veterans who had proven themselves in battle. And here's something that often gets overlooked. They all had living sons. Why does that matter? Because Sparta needed to ensure its citizen lines would continue. If these men died, at least their family names would survive through their sons. 300 Spartans, that's what the religious restrictions allowed Leonidas to take while still technically observing the Carnia. It was a legal loophole, a way to honor both the gods and military necessity. 300 warriors to face an empire. But they wouldn't be alone. Other Greek city-states sent contingents. The Thespians sent 700. The Thebans sent 400. Various other cities contributed forces until Leonidas commanded about 7,000 men total when they reached Thermopylae. Before he left, the ephors consulted the oracle at Delphi, as was tradition for major military decisions. The oracle's prophecy was chilling. Either Sparta would be sacked by the Persians, or it would lose a king from the line of Heracles. Think about that. The gods were saying essentially someone important has to die, or your entire city falls. That wasn't a prophecy, that was a death sentence with a choice attached. Leonidas knew this. He knew what the oracle had said, and he chose to go anyway. There's a scene that ancient sources describe, though we can't be certain of the exact details. Before Leonidas marched out, Gorgo asked him what she should do if he didn't return. His response was classically Spartan: marry a good man and bear good children. No dramatics, no tears, just practical advice. Because that's what Sparta needed, the continuation of strong bloodlines. Personal feelings didn't enter into it. Duty was everything. As Leonidas led his 300 toward Thermopylae, they stopped along the way to gather allied forces. Word spread through Greece: the Spartans are marching. The king himself is leading them. This isn't a token gesture, this is serious. City-states that had been wavering, wondering whether to resist or submit, saw Spartan resolve and found their own courage. This is the power of leadership by example. Leonidas didn't send his men to hold Thermopylae while he stayed safe in Sparta. He didn't command from the rear. A 50-year-old king who could have easily justified staying behind chose to march at the head of his troops toward a battle he knew he wouldn't survive. Why? Because he'd been through the agoge. He'd learned that Spartan kings led from the front. He'd internalized the code: death before dishonor, duty before self, Sparta above all. Some historians suggest Leonidas thought the force was sufficient, that 7,000 men could actually hold Thermopylae indefinitely. Others argue he knew it was a suicide mission from the start, designed to inspire Greece and buy time. We'll never know for certain what he believed when he left Sparta. What we do know is this: he marched north with his warriors toward a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, toward a place where the fate of Western civilization would be decided, toward glory and death at the hot gates. And when he arrived at Thermopylae, when he saw the geography with his own eyes, when he understood exactly what he and his men were about to face, Leonidas made preparations not for victory, but for the most famous last stand in human history. But before that battle began, before the first Persian arrow flew, there was a moment of political drama that would determine whether Greece stood united or fell divided. Because not all Greeks wanted to fight. Many were still debating whether resistance was even possible, and the decisions made in those final days before combat would shape everything that followed. Next, we're diving into the Greek dilemma, the political chaos, the debates, the betrayals and unlikely alliances that preceded Thermopylae. We'll see how a fractured collection of city-states tried to become something they'd never been before united. And we'll discover why that unity was so fragile, so precious, and so crucial to what happened next. Stay with me. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine the United States suddenly ceased to exist as a country. No federal government, no unified military, no shared identity. Instead, Texas, California, New York, and every other state became completely independent nations, each with their own army, their own laws, their own foreign policy. Now imagine a superpower like China invading, and all these former states have to somehow work together to defend themselves, despite centuries of rivalry, different cultures, and mutual distrust. That's basically what ancient Greece was facing in 481 BC. Because here's the thing most people don't realize. There was no Greece in the way we think of countries today. There was no Greek nation, no Greek government, no Greek unity. What existed was a collection of hundreds of independent city-states polis scattered across the mainland, the islands, and the coasts of Asia Minor. They spoke variations of the same language, worshipped the same gods, and shared certain cultural traditions. But politically, they were separate, sovereign, and often hostile to each other. Athens and Sparta had been rivals for decades. Thebes had its own ambitions. Corinth was a major trading power with different priorities. Some city-states were democracies, others oligarchies, still others tyrannies. They'd been fighting each other for generations over trade routes, territorial disputes, and plain old pride. And now they were supposed to unite against Persia. Yeah, good luck with that. The challenge wasn't just military, it was psychological, cultural, and political. Getting these fiercely independent city-states to cooperate was like herding cats. Cats that spoke different dialects, had blood feuds with each other, and were convinced they knew best. Let me give you some perspective on how fractured Greece really was. There were over 1,000 independent Greek city-states in the 5th century BC. When Xerxes sent his heralds demanding earth and water in 481 BC, requesting submission, guess how many city-states joined the resistance? About 31. 31 out of over 1,000. The rest either submitted to Persia, immediately declared neutrality, or just waited to see which way the wind would blow. Can you blame them? From their perspective, resisting the Persian Empire was suicide. Why throw away your city, your people, your future for a hopeless cause? This is where we need to talk about a concept the Greeks called medizing, which meant siding with the Medes, another name for the Persians. It wasn't necessarily viewed as treasonous at the time, because again, there was no unified Greece to betray. If your city-state calculated that submission would bring prosperity and survival, while resistance would bring annihilation, choosing Persia was the rational choice. And Xerxes was smart about this. He wasn't just conquering through military force, he was using diplomacy, bribery, and political pressure. He'd send ambassadors offering generous terms: submit, peacefully, keep your autonomy, pay tribute, and you'll prosper under Persian protection. We'll even let you keep your local government. Resist, and we'll burn your city to the ground and enslave your population. For many city-states, especially smaller ones without strong militaries, this was an easy decision. Northern Greece, Thessaly, Macedonia, much of Thrace submitted almost immediately when they saw the size of Xerxes' army. These weren't cowards, they were realists. What could a city of 5,000 people do against an army of 200,000? Even some major cities wavered. Thebes, one of the most powerful city-states, was deeply divided. Some Thebans wanted to resist, others wanted to submit. This internal conflict would have massive consequences at Thermopylae, as we'll see. Argos, another major power, declared neutrality, which, let's be honest, was basically passive submission. They had a long-standing rivalry with Sparta, and weren't thrilled about helping their enemies even against Persia. The island of Delos, sacred to Apollo, tried to claim religious neutrality. Syracuse and other Greek colonies in Sicily and southern Italy were dealing with their own Carthaginian invasion, which, interesting side note, some historians believe was coordinated with Xerxes to prevent Western Greek reinforcements. Talk about strategic planning. So Athens and Sparta were facing a reality where most of Greece either wouldn't help or actively opposed them. Unity wasn't just difficult, it seemed impossible. But something remarkable happened in the autumn of 481 BC. Representatives from various city-states met at the Isthmus of Corinth for what we might call the First Pan-Hellenic Congress. This was extraordinary. Greeks didn't do this. They didn't hold international conferences. They didn't form lasting alliances. Their default mode was competition, not cooperation. Yet here they were, delegates from 31 city-states, gathering to discuss collective defense. The mere fact that this meeting happened was revolutionary. The Congress faced immediate problems. First, who's in charge? Athens had the largest fleet, probably around 200 triremes by 480 BC, which was massive. They'd used silver from the mines at Laurium to build this navy, a decision pushed through by an Athenian politician named Themistocles, who'd been warning about Persian invasion for years. But Sparta had the reputation as the premier land power. Their warriors were legendary. So right away there's tension. Who commands? Who makes strategic decisions? The compromise Sparta would command both land and naval forces. The Athenians swallowed their pride and agreed because they needed Spartan hoplites and Spartan credibility to convince other city-states to join. This was huge. Athens accepting Spartan leadership went against everything their democratic culture valued, but survival trumped pride. Second problem: strategy. How do you defend against an invasion force that can attack by both land and sea? The Persians had hundreds of warships supporting their army. They could land troops anywhere along the coast. You couldn't defend everywhere. Greece had thousands of miles of coastline and limited forces. The Greeks needed to force a confrontation where terrain neutralized Persian numerical advantage. They needed choke points, places so narrow that even a massive army couldn't bring its full force to bear. Initially, they considered the Vale of Tempe in Thessaly, a northern valley that seemed defensible. In early 480 BC, they sent a force of 10,000 hoplites to occupy it. But then Alexander I of Macedon, who'd already submitted to Persia, but was secretly sympathetic to Greece, sent a warning that valley could be bypassed through at least 2 other mountain passes. Also, he said you should see the size of the Persian army coming. It's overwhelming. The Greeks took one look at the terrain, realized they could be flanked and retreated. This was a blow to morale, and it had immediate political consequences. Thessaly, seeing that the Greeks couldn't defend them, submitted to Persia. This created a domino effect. Other northern cities followed suit. Now the defensive line had to be drawn further south. Themistocles proposed an alternative strategy that was brilliant in its simplicity: force the Persians through Thermopylae on land, while the Greek fleet held the strait at Artemisium at sea. Here's why this was genius. These 2 locations were close enough, about 40 miles apart, that they could support each other. If the Persians forced Thermopylae, the Greek fleet would have to retreat because the army could be attacked from behind. If the Persian fleet destroyed the Greek navy, Thermopylae would have to be abandoned because the Persians could land troops behind the pass. The 2 defences were linked. They'd stand together or fall together. But this strategy required something unprecedented: actual coordination between city-states. The Athenian fleet had to trust Spartan leadership. Spartan hoplites had to rely on Athenian sailors. Everyone had to commit forces and follow the plan even when things got scary, and things were about to get very scary. Now we need to talk about the religious complications, because they were massive. The Greeks lived in a world where divine will mattered. You didn't just make military decisions based on tactics, you consulted oracles, you watched for omens, you respected sacred festivals. In August of 480 BC, as Xerxes was marching south, 2 major religious events were happening: the Carnea festival at Sparta and the Olympic Games. Both forbade warfare. The gods had to be honoured first. But Xerxes wasn't going to wait for Greek religious observances to conclude. He was coming now. So Sparta found a loophole. Leonidas could take a small advance force, his 300 royal guards, while the main army would follow after the festival. Similarly, other city-states sent advance contingents with promises of larger forces to come later. This created a dangerous situation. The men at Thermopylae would be badly outnumbered, holding the line with the promise, the hope that reinforcements would arrive. It was a calculated risk born of religious obligation and political compromise. The oracle at Delphi added another layer of anxiety. When various city-states consulted the oracle about the Persian invasion, the prophecies were almost universally grim. Athens received a prophecy so terrifying that their delegates begged for a second consultation. The priestess basically told them to flee, that their city would burn, that only wooden walls would save them. What did wooden walls mean? Was it the ancient wooden fortification on the Acropolis? Or was it their fleet ships with wooden hulls? Themistocles argued brilliantly that it meant the fleet that Athens' salvation lay at sea, not in trying to defend the city directly. This interpretation would prove crucial at the Battle of Salamis, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The prophecy Leonidas received was even more specific. Sparta would either lose its city or lose a king from the line of Heracles. There was no good option there, just a choice of which catastrophe to accept. Yet despite these dire prophecies, despite the religious complications, despite the overwhelming odds, the Hellenic League committed to resistance. Why? What makes people choose almost certain death over comfortable submission? I think it comes down to identity. The Greeks, for all their differences, shared something fundamental. They weren't Persian. They weren't subjects of an emperor. They valued autonomy, the right to govern themselves, argue with each other, make their own terrible decisions. The idea of bowing to a foreign king, of losing that independence, was existentially threatening. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but it captures the Greek mindset perfectly. When Xerxes sent ambassadors to Sparta demanding submission, the Spartans allegedly asked the Persians, "What's it like serving one master?" The Persian ambassadors, confused, replied, "What do you mean Xerxes rules us all?" And the Spartans said, "Then you wouldn't understand what we're fighting for. Freedom versus security, autonomy versus stability. It's a tension that still exists today, isn't it? How much liberty are you willing to risk for safety? How much safety are you willing to sacrifice for freedom?" The Greeks chose freedom, but that choice came with a price tag that would be paid in blood. As spring turned to summer in 480. BC, Greek scouts reported that the Persian army had crossed the Hellespont and was marching through Thrace. The invasion was real. It was happening. No more time for debate or political maneuvering. Leonidas marched north with his 300 Spartans and whatever allied forces would join him. As they travelled, more contingents fell in: 700 Thespians, 400, Thebans 1,000, Phocians, smaller groups from various cities. By the time they reached Thermopylae, Leonidas commanded approximately 7,000 men. 7,000 against an empire. Now here's something important. Many historians believe Leonidas initially thought this force might actually be sufficient, not to defeat the Persians outright, but to hold them long enough that the full Greek army could mobilize. Hold for a few weeks, maybe a month, until tens of thousands of reinforcements arrived. The pass was narrow, the defensive position strong. It was possible. Others argue Leonidas knew from the start this was a one-way mission, that he understood the oracle's prophecy meant his death, and he chose Thermopylae as the place to fulfill it. The truth, we'll never know exactly what he believed when he marched north. What we do know is that when the Hellenic League committed to defending Thermopylae, they were betting everything on a strategy that depended on factors they couldn't control. Religious festivals ending on time, reinforcements arriving as promised, city-states keeping their word despite fear the Persian fleet being delayed by weather, and the Persians not finding a way around the pass. It was a plan held together by hope, prayer, and sheer, stubborn Greek refusal to accept the inevitable. But you know what? Sometimes the most audacious plans are the ones that succeed. Sometimes the underdog's desperate gambit becomes the stuff of legend. Sometimes geography, courage, and a little bit of luck combine to create moments that change history. And speaking of geography, we need to talk about Thermopylae itself, because the location where this drama would unfold wasn't just any mountain pass. It was a natural fortress, a geographical anomaly that would allow a handful of warriors to defy an empire. Understanding that terrain is crucial to understanding what happened next. Next, we're going to walk through the hot gates together. We'll see why Themistocles chose this spot. We'll understand how a pass just a few dozen feet wide could become the most important piece of real estate in the ancient world. And we'll discover why the Greeks believed, maybe rightly, that geography could become their greatest weapon. Let's go see where legends were born. There's an old military saying, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. But there's a level beyond that, masters talk terrain. Because all the bravery in the world, all the training, all the superior equipment means nothing if you're fighting on ground that works against you. The Greeks understood this instinctively. They couldn't match Persian numbers, couldn't outlast Persian resources, couldn't outmaneuver Persian cavalry on open plains. So they chose to fight when none of that mattered. They chose Thermopylae. Let me take you there. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You're standing in central Greece in August of 480 BC. Behind you to the south, lie the Greek heartlands, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, all the cities that refuse to bow. Ahead of you to the north, somewhere beyond the horizon, marches the largest army the world has ever seen. Between you and that army mountains, the Kalidromos range rises steep and jagged on your right peaks, reaching over 4,000 feet. These aren't gentle rolling hills, these are proper mountains with cliffs, ravines and slopes too steep for any army to traverse, especially one hauling siege equipment and supply wagons. On your left, the sea. The Malian Gulf stretches out toward the horizon, its waters part of the Aegean. The shoreline is rocky, unsuitable for landing ships in most places, and the Greek fleet is holding position at Artemisium to prevent Persian naval flanking maneuvers anyway. And in between the mountains and the sea, a strip of flat coastal ground. That's Thermopylae, literally, the hot gates, in Greek named for the hot sulphur springs that bubble up from the ground there. Ancient travellers would have smelled those springs long before seeing the pass a sulphurous welcome to one of the most strategically important locations in Greece. Now here's the crucial detail. That strip of flat ground was narrow, really narrow, at its narrowest point, and this is based on ancient descriptions and modern archaeological surveys. The pass was only about 40 to 50 feet wide. Some ancient sources suggest it might have been even narrower, as little as 12 to 15 feet. In places, though, geological changes over 2,500 years make exact measurements impossible. Think about what that means tactically. 50 feet. That's about the width of a two-lane road. That's what separated the mountains from the sea at Thermopylae's narrowest point. You could fit maybe 16 to 20 hoplites standing shoulder to shoulder in a formation that narrow. That's it. Doesn't matter if you have 1,000 soldiers or 100,000, only about 20 can fight at the front line at any given moment. Everyone else is just waiting behind them, unable to contribute. This is what military theorists call a force multiplier, when terrain allows a smaller force to fight effectively against a much larger one. And Thermopylae was perhaps the greatest natural force multiplier in the ancient world. But let's go deeper, because understanding exactly why Themistocles and Leonidas chose this spot requires understanding the full tactical picture. The pass wasn't just one narrow section. It was actually about 3 miles long from north to south, with 3 distinct narrow sections: the east gate, the middle gate, and the west gate. Each gate was a natural choke point where the mountains came closest to the sea. The Greeks positioned themselves at the middle gate, which offered the best defensive position. Why the middle and not one of the ends? Strategic depth. If they held the northern entrance and the Persians somehow broke through, there'd be nothing but open ground behind them. By positioning in the middle, they created multiple fallback positions. There was also an ancient Phocian wall at this spot, basically a crumbling defensive fortification that had been built centuries earlier to protect against northern invasions. When Leonidas arrived, he immediately ordered his men to rebuild and strengthen this wall. They worked day and night stacking stones, creating a defensive barrier about 6 feet high that stretched from the mountainside to the water's edge. Behind this wall, the Greeks would make their stand. Attackers would have to approach through the narrow pass, then try to scale or break through the wall, while Greek spears stabbed down at them. It was a defensive position that maximized every advantage the Greeks had. Now you might be wondering, why couldn't the Persians just go around? Why not march inland through the mountains or land troops from ships further south along the coast? Great questions. Let's address them. First, the mountains. The Kalidromos range wasn't just steep, it was labyrinthine. Narrow goat paths wound through the peaks. But these trails were known only to locals, were barely wide enough for men on foot, and certainly couldn't accommodate an army with baggage trains and equipment. You might get a small raiding party through, but not an invasion force. Plus those paths would put soldiers in terrible tactical positions, strung out in single file, vulnerable to ambush, unable to form proper battle lines. There was one notable mountain path that would later become crucial to the battle's outcome, but we'll get to that betrayal soon enough. For now, just know that going over the mountains wasn't a realistic option for the main Persian army. Second, the naval option. Why not just load troops on ships and land them south of Thermopylae, bypassing the pass entirely? This is where the coordinated Greek strategy becomes clear. Remember, the Greek fleet was holding position at Artemisium, blocking the strait that led south. The Persians couldn't simply sail past with troop ships, they'd have to defeat the Greek navy first. And here's the beautiful symmetry of the Greek plan: the fleet at Artemisium and the army at Thermopylae were mutually supporting. If the Persians concentrated their fleet to force the strait, they'd be vulnerable to Greek counterattacks. If they split their forces, neither group would be strong enough to break through. The Greeks had created a strategic bottleneck on both land and sea simultaneously. It was brilliant. Frustrating as hell if you're Xerxes, but absolutely brilliant from a Greek perspective. Let me give you a modern comparison to help visualize why this terrain was so valuable. Imagine trying to invade Switzerland through a single mountain tunnel. You could have the most advanced military in the world, but if that tunnel is only wide enough for 2 tanks side by side, you can't bring your full force to bear. The defenders can hold indefinitely as long as they can keep replacing casualties at the same rate they're inflicting them. That's essentially what the Greeks created at Thermopylae, a geographic bottleneck that neutralized Persian numerical superiority. But terrain alone wouldn't be enough. The Greeks needed the right troops to exploit it. And this is where we need to talk about the hoplite phalanx, because understanding Greek tactics is crucial to understanding why Thermopylae worked at least for a while. A hoplite was a Greek heavy infantryman. The name comes from the hoplon, the large round shield each soldier carried. This shield was about 3 feet in diameter, made of wood covered with bronze, and weighed around 15 to 20 pounds. It had an arm strap in the centre and a grip at the rim, which meant it was held firmly against your left side. Now here's the key tactical detail. The shield protected not just you, but also the man to your left. Your right side was protected by the shield of the man to your right. This created overlapping protection, but it also meant that breaking formation meant death for you and your neighbours. The phalanx only worked if everyone held their position. Each hoplite also carried a doria spear about 7 to 9 feet long, with a bronze or iron spearhead at one end and a bronze spike at the other. The spike served as a counterweight and could be used as a backup weapon if the spear shaft broke. You'd hold this spear overhand or underhand depending on the situation, thrusting rather than throwing. For close combat, you had a short sword called a xophos, usually about 2 feet long, leaf-shaped, designed for stabbing in the press of battle, where there wasn't room to swing. The armour varied depending on wealth. Spartans, being full-time warriors supported by helot labour, could afford the best a bronze breastplate thorax, bronze greaves protecting the shins, a bronze helmet, usually the distinctive Corinthian style that covered most of the face, and sometimes arm guards. This kit weighed about 50 to 70 pounds total. Now move this individual hoplite into formation. The phalanx was typically 8 ranks deep, sometimes more. The front rank does the actual fighting. The second and third ranks can reach over with their spears to stab at enemies. The rear ranks provide physical pressure, literally pushing the men in front forward, preventing retreat, adding momentum to the formation. When 2 phalanxes collided, and that's the right word, collided, it was called the othismos, or the push. It wasn't elegant or heroic in the way movies portray. It was grinding, brutal pressure warfare. Men in bronze armour packed shoulder to shoulder, pushing and stabbing in intense heat, unable to see much through their helmets, breathing hard legs, burning from maintaining stance arms, aching from holding shields and thrusting spears. Battles were often decided not by who was more skilled, but by who broke first. Which formation's rear rank started backing up, whose front line began to panic and lose cohesion. The moment a phalanx broke, it became a massacre, men turning to run, exposing their backs, being cut down as they fled. But at Thermopylae, the Greeks wouldn't be facing another phalanx. They'd be facing Persian troops with fundamentally different equipment and tactics. The backbone of the Persian infantry were soldiers with shorter spears, maybe 6 feet long and lighter, wicker shields. They wore less armour, prioritizing mobility over protection. Persian tactics emphasized speed archery and overwhelming numbers rather than the grinding push of hoplite warfare. In an open-field battle, Persian mobility was an advantage. They could maneuver around slow-moving phalanxes, use cavalry to attack flanks, and rear-shower enemies with arrows from distance. But at Thermopylae there was nowhere to maneuver, no room for cavalry charges, and archery was less effective against heavily armoured men fighting behind a wall. The narrow pass forced the Persians to attack in a compressed column straight into the Greek spear wall. It was like trying to push a freight train through a phone booth. All their advantages became irrelevant. All the Greeks' advantages became magnified. Let me paint you a picture of what Xerxes saw when his scouts reported back about the Greek position. You've marched your massive army hundreds of miles. You've conquered every kingdom and city in your path. You've engineered miracles, bridged the Hellespont, dug a canal through a peninsula. You've got the most powerful military force ever assembled, and now you're stopped by a pile of rocks and maybe 7,000 men standing behind it. For a king who believed himself chosen by the gods, who'd whipped the sea itself for defying him, this must have been infuriating. The Greeks weren't just refusing to submit, they were insulting him by suggesting his glorious army could be stopped by terrain and stubbornness. Ancient sources tell us that Xerxes initially waited 4 days before attacking. 4 days. Why, probably hoping the Greeks would see sense and retreat. He sent scouts to observe their positions. The scouts reported something strange. Some of the Greek warriors were outside the wall exercising, combing their long hair, apparently unconcerned about the massive army gathering before them. When this was reported to Xerxes, he allegedly consulted Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king who'd been living at the Persian court. Demaratus explained, "They're preparing for battle. It's Spartan custom to tend to their hair before risking their lives. These men are about to fight to the death." Xerxes reportedly laughed. The idea that these few warriors would stand against his hundreds of thousands seemed absurd. But Demaratus warned him, "You're about to face the finest warriors in Greece. They fear shame more than death. They will not yield." On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ran out. He gave the order to attack. The first wave of Persian infantry began their march into the pass. The Battle of Thermopylae was about to begin, and what happened over the next 3 days would become one of the most analysed, debated and legendary military engagements in human history. Not because the Greeks won, spoiler alert, they didn't, but because of how they fought. Because of what their stand meant. Because geography, training, courage and strategy combined to create something that resonated across millennia. But before we dive into the battle itself, the clash of spears, the rivers of blood, the moments of triumph and tragedy, we need to set the scene completely. We need to understand what that first day was like when the Persian Empire met the Spartan shield wall, when theory became reality, when Xerxes discovered that sometimes the bravest soldiers and the best tactics aren't enough if you're fighting on the wrong ground. Next, we're going into the chaos of combat. Day 1 at Thermopylae, when the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and the ancient world held its breath to see what would happen. Stay with me. This is where history gets written in blood. Morning broke over Thermopylae on what we believe was around August 17th, 480 BC. Can you imagine that moment? The sun rising over the Malian Gulf, burning off the morning mist, revealing 2 armies facing each other across a narrow strip of land. On one side, the largest military force the ancient world had ever assembled. On the other, maybe 7,000 Greeks, who'd chosen to stand rather than run. The waiting was over. The talking was done. Now came the test that would answer a question humans have asked throughout history. Can courage overcome impossible odds? Can a few determined souls actually stop an empire? We were about to find out. Xerxes gave the order to attack, but not with his best troops. Not yet. He sent in the Medes and the Scythians, first solid soldiers from the eastern provinces of his empire, experienced warriors who'd conquered kingdoms from India to Egypt. These weren't raw recruits. These were professional fighters who'd won battles across 3 continents. The Persian king probably thought this would be over quickly. Surely these provincial troops would be enough to dislodge a few thousand Greeks from a broken-down wall, save the elite immortals for a real fight. This was just pest control. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating your enemy. The Medes advanced through the narrow pass, their formation compressing, as the walls of the pass squeezed them together. Imagine you're in that Persian column. You've marched for months to get here. You've seen your army stretch to the horizon. You know you outnumber the enemy maybe 30 to 1, maybe more. This should be easy. But as you get closer to that rebuilt Phocian wall, something starts to feel wrong. The pass is narrower than you expected. There's no room to spread out. The men beside you are pressed shoulder to shoulder. You can't really maneuver. And behind that wall you can see Greek helmets, those distinctive Corinthian designs, with just eye slits and a T-shaped opening for the mouth. You can't see their faces, can't read their expressions. They're just bronze statues standing motionless, silent. Then the order comes attack. The Medes surged forward with battle cries meant to intimidate, to overwhelm, to terrify their enemies into breaking. This was standard Persian tactics, use noise, momentum, and numbers to create panic. It worked against most opponents. It didn't work on Spartans. The Greeks didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show any reaction at all. They stood in perfect formation, shields, locked spears, levelled waiting. The discipline was inhuman. The self-control was absolute. Remember, these men had been trained since age 7 to stand in formation no matter what. Pain, fear, death, none of it justified breaking ranks. When the Medes hit the Greek line, it was like waves crashing against a cliff. The Greek spears had about a 2-foot reach advantage over Persian weapons. That might not sound like much, but in the press of battle it was everything. Greek spear points found Persian flesh before Persian weapons could reach Greek bodies. Men in the front ranks of the Persian assault were stabbed in the throat, the face, the chest bronze spear heads, punching through their lighter armour or finding gaps in their protection. The bodies started piling up almost immediately. Here's what makes the phalanx so devastating in close quarters. It's not about individual skill, it's about collective pressure. The man stabbing you with a spear isn't fighting alone, he's supported by 7 ranks of men behind him pushing, adding weight and momentum. If you try to push him back, you're not fighting one man, you're fighting the combined mass of dozens. And the shields, those heavy bronze-faced shields, became weapons themselves. Greeks would use them to punch, to shove, to knock enemies off balance. A shield smashed into your face could break your nose, crack your skull, knock you senseless. And the moment you stumbled, a dozen Greek spears would find you. The Medes fought bravely. Ancient sources make that clear. They pressed the attack for hours, wave after wave, trying to break through or climb over the wall. But every assault failed. The math was simple and brutal. The Greeks could replace casualties in the front rank faster than the Persians could inflict them, and the narrow pass prevented the Persians from bringing their numerical advantage to bear. Herodotus, our primary source for this battle, writes that the Persians showed no lack of valour, but that their weapons and armour were inferior, and they lacked the training to fight effectively in such close quarters. That's ancient Greek for, they were brave but they got massacred. After hours of futile attacks, the Median and Scythian units were pulled back, bloodied and demoralised. How many died? We don't have exact numbers for day 1 specifically, but Herodotus claims the Persians lost 20,000 men total across the 3 days of battle. Even if that's an exaggeration and ancient casualty figures usually are, we're still talking about thousands of Persian soldiers dead on the first day alone. Greek casualties minimal. Maybe a few dozen wounded, perhaps a handful killed. The defensive advantage was that overwhelming. Now, put yourself in Xerxes' position for a moment. You're sitting on a golden throne on a hillside overlooking the battle. You can see everything. You watched your troops march confidently into that pass. You watched them just die. Hundreds, maybe thousands of your soldiers, some of the best fighters in your empire, couldn't budge a few thousand Greeks from a crumbling wall. This isn't just a military setback. This is embarrassing. This is the kind of thing that makes other provinces question whether your empire is really invincible. This is dangerous. So Xerxes made his next move. He sent in the best he had, the troops who'd never failed him, the ones whose reputation alone made enemies surrender without fighting. He sent in the immortals. The immortals, the Athanatoi in Greek, was Xerxes' elite guard, 10,000 strong. They were called immortals because their unit was always kept at exactly 10,000 men. If someone died or was too injured to fight, they were immediately replaced so the unit appeared immortal, never diminishing in number. Pretty clever psychological warfare, actually. These were the best trained, best equipped soldiers in the Persian army. They wore scale armour, carried better shields, wielded spears equal in length to Greek weapons. They were chosen from the nobility trained from youth specifically for the guard. If anyone could break the Greek line, it was them. The immortals advanced in formation, disciplined, professional. No wild charges, no battle cries. They approached the Greek position with the confidence of men who'd conquered the known world. Around them, the regular Persian soldiers watched, expecting to see their champion succeed where the others had failed. And they failed just as spectacularly. Because here's the thing, equipment matters, but so does training and tactics. The immortals were excellent troops by Persian standards, but they weren't trained from age 7 to fight in a phalanx. They hadn't spent years learning to move as one organism to maintain formation under impossible pressure to stand firm when every instinct screams at you to run. The Spartans had. When the immortals hit the Greek line, something interesting happened. Something that shows you the tactical brilliance of Leonidas and his commanders. The Greeks started using feigned retreats. Here's how it worked. The Greek front line would suddenly appear to break. They'd turn and run shields on their backs, looking like they were fleeing in panic. The immortals, thinking they'd finally broken through, would charge after them formation, loosening individual warriors rushing forward to claim glory by being the first to strike down a fleeing enemy. Then on a signal, probably a war horn or a shouted command, the Greeks would spin around, reform their phalanx in seconds, and present a wall of shields and spears to the now disordered Persians who'd been chasing them. The immortals caught out of formation would be cut to pieces. This tactic requires incredible discipline and training. You're asking men to turn their backs to the enemy, every warrior's nightmare, run a certain distance, then turn and fight precisely when commanded. One person breaking ranks, one moment of actual panic, and the whole thing collapses. But the Spartans could do it. They'd practiced it thousands of times during the Agoj. The Greeks would execute this maneuver repeatedly throughout the day. Feigned retreat, reform, slaughter. The pursuers returned to defensive position, over and over, and apparently the Persians kept falling for it. You'd think after the third or fourth time they'd catch on, but in the chaos and noise and fear of battle with limited communication and poor visibility in the pass, the same trap kept working. By the end of the first day, the immortals had been repulsed with heavy casualties. Xerxes' elite guard, the troops that never lost, had lost badly. Ancient sources tell us that Xerxes leaped up from his throne 3 times during the battle in shock at what he was witnessing. Whether this detail is true or not, it captures the magnitude of what was happening. The greatest military force in the world was being held at bay by a tiny fraction of its numbers. But let's talk about what this day was actually like for the men fighting, because the clinical description of tactics and formations doesn't capture the reality of ancient combat. First, the heat. It's August in Greece. You're wearing 50 to 70 pounds of bronze armor. Bronze conducts heat like crazy. Inside that helmet, you're breathing recycled air that's probably 110 degrees or hotter. Sweat is pouring down your face, stinging your eyes, making everything slippery. Your mouth is dry. Your muscles are burning. You're exhausted before the fighting even starts. Then add the physical exertion. You're not just standing there, you're pushing, bracing, stabbing over and over for hours. Your arms feel like lead. Your legs are shaking, your back is screaming. But you can't show weakness, can't falter. Because the man next to you is depending on you, and you're depending on him. The noise would be overwhelming. Bronze weapons hitting bronze armor creates a clanging that's almost deafening. Men screaming in rage, in pain, in fear. Officers shouting commands. The wounded crying out. Your own breathing rasping inside your helmet, sounding impossibly loud in your ears. The smell. Blood has a distinctive metallic smell. Add to that human sweat, fear-induced bowel, releases the sulfur from the hot springs dust kicked up by thousands of feet. It would be nauseating. And the fear. Oh, the fear! Because no matter how well trained you are, standing in the front rank, while thousands of men try to kill you, is terrifying. People talk about ancient warriors being fearless, but that's nonsense. They felt fear just like anyone would. The difference was they'd been conditioned to act despite it, to maintain discipline while absolutely terrified. The front rank at Thermopylae was rotated regularly. You couldn't fight for hours straight, it's physically impossible. So units would take turns, fight for maybe 30 minutes to an hour, then rotate to the rear, rest, drink water, have minor wounds tended, then cycle back to the front. This rotation was crucial for maintaining the defensive line, but even in the rear ranks there was no safety. Persian archers were firing volleys into the pass. Arrows would arc over the melee coming down randomly. You never knew when a bronze-tipped arrow would punch through a gap in your armor or find your throat. The uncertainty, the randomness of it would have been psychologically exhausting. By the end of day 1, as the sun set over the Gulf and Persian commanders ordered their troops to withdraw, both sides took stock. The Persians had lost thousands of men. Their best troops had been repulsed. The Medes were shaken. The immortals had been humiliated. Morale was plummeting. Soldiers around campfires were whispering, maybe the Greeks really are protected by their gods. Maybe we can't win this. The Greeks had proven their strategy worked. They'd held the pass. Casualties were minimal. Spirits were high. Messages were sent south. We're holding. Send reinforcements. This is working. But both sides knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. The Greeks had finite numbers. Eventually exhaustion and casualties would thin their ranks. The Persians had virtually infinite replacements. They could rotate fresh troops in daily while the Greeks fought with the same men. And there was another problem. Leonidas was becoming aware of supplies. The Greeks had some supplies cached at Thermopylae, but they were running a marathon, not a sprint. How long could they hold a week too? What if the promised reinforcements didn't arrive? What if the religious festivals dragged on and the main Spartan army never came? For Xerxes, the calculation was different but equally troubling. Every day spent at Thermopylae was a day his massive army consumed supplies. Every day gave the Greeks more time to fortify southern positions. Every day of stalemate made him look weaker. His engineers and advisors were studying the problem: how do we break this deadlock? As darkness fell on the first day of battle, both commanders faced a night of difficult decisions. The Persians needed a new strategy. Brute force clearly wasn't working. The Greeks needed to maintain morale and stamina for what would surely be more of the same when the sun rose. Neither side could know that the second day would be even more brutal than the first, that Xerxes would throw everything he had against that wall, that the Greeks would be tested to the absolute limits of human endurance, that the narrow pass would run red with blood as the empire's pride collided again and again with Spartan steel. The first day had been shocking. The second day would be legendary. And on that second day we'd see the truest test of what the Agog had created. Not just warriors who could fight, but warriors who simply would not break no matter what came at them. Let's see what happened when the unstoppable force tried again to move the immovable object. Dawn came too quickly for both armies. The Persians camped in their thousands across the plain. North of the pass had spent a restless night listening to the moans of their wounded and the whispered fears of soldiers who'd seen their comrades die by the hundreds. The Greeks behind their rebuilt wall tended to minor injuries, rotated watch duties, and tried to grab whatever sleep they could while knowing that sunrise would bring fresh hell. But here's what's remarkable. Nobody on the Greek side was talking about retreat. Not one ancient source suggests that Leonidas or his commanders even considered withdrawing after day one. They'd proven the pass could be held. The plan was working. They just had to do it again. Easier said than done. Xerxes had a problem. Actually, he had several problems. But the biggest one was psychological. His entire empire was built on the perception of invincibility. When Persia came knocking, cities surrendered without a fight, because everyone knew resistance was futile. But now thousands of his soldiers, including his elite immortals, had been thrown back by a tiny Greek force. Word of this defeat would spread. Was already spreading. Persian soldiers were talking, scouts and messengers were carrying the news. Every hour that the Greeks held that pass, every additional casualty chipped away at the myth of Persian supremacy. So Xerxes couldn't just wait them out. He couldn't bypass them. He had to break them quickly and decisively to prove that day one was a fluke, that Persian power was still absolute, that resistance was still futile. On the morning of the second day, probably August 18th, Xerxes ordered renewed assaults. But this time he changed tactics. No more piecemeal attacks. No more testing the Greek defences with provincial troops. This time he'd throw wave after wave at them, fresh troops replacing exhausted ones, keeping constant pressure on the defenders. It was a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, the side with more bodies usually wins. The attacks began at first light. Different Persian units cycled through each one, pressing the assault for an hour or two, before being relieved by fresh troops. Medes, Scythians, Sacae, Indians, Bactrians. Xerxes drew from every corner of his empire. Each contingent fought in their own style with their own weapons, which meant the Greeks had to constantly adapt to different threats. But the Greeks had a trick of their own. They rotated units too. Remember, Leonidas didn't just have 300 Spartans, he commanded about 7,000 men from various city-states. While the Spartans held the line, Thespians could rest. While Thespians fought, Phocians could recover. This rotation kept the defenders relatively fresh and gave them breaks to drink water, eat a bit of food, have wounds bandaged. Still, this was exponentially harder than day one. Imagine you're a Greek hoplite on day two. You've already fought for hours yesterday. Your muscles are sore, your body is bruised. Maybe you took a minor wound, a cut on your arm, a spear graze on your thigh. Nothing serious, but it hurts. You're tired. Really tired. The kind of tired where your hands shake and your legs feel like they're made of wood. And now you've got to do it all again. This is where the Agog training became crucial. Not the combat skills, those were important, obviously, but the psychological conditioning. Spartans had been taught since childhood to endure pain, to function through exhaustion, to keep going when their body screamed at them to stop. The ability to suffer indefinitely was their superpower. One account from Herodotus captures this perfectly. He describes how the Greeks would fight in shifts, but the Spartans always seemed to be in the front rank. When asked why they didn't rotate back more often, a Spartan warrior allegedly replied, "Because we're not tired yet." This was probably bravado. They were definitely tired, but the psychological message was clear. We can do this all day. The feigned retreat tactic continued to work on day two. which is honestly kind of amazing. You'd think Persian commanders would have figured it out by now and warned their troops. When the Greeks run, don't chase them, it's a trap. But in the chaos of battle with limited communication and rotating fresh troops who hadn't seen this tactic, before the same trap kept claiming victims, there's something darkly comedic about this. The most sophisticated military machine in the world with centuries of combat experience kept falling for the same trick. It's like watching someone touch a hot stove get burned and then immediately touch it again, except with more spears and death. But let's be fair to the Persians. When you're in the middle of a battle, adrenaline pumping, your friends dying around you, and suddenly the enemy appears to break, you chase. It's instinct. It's what warriors do. Overriding that instinct requires the kind of discipline that takes years to develop. The Spartans had those years. The Persians didn't. By midday, something interesting started happening. The Persian attacks became less coordinated. Units were arriving tired from their long march, being thrown immediately into combat, getting chewed up and being pulled back in disorder. The constant cycle of units moving in and out of the narrow pass created traffic jams. Supply lines were getting congested. The sheer logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of men were starting to work against Xerxes. Meanwhile, Greek morale was actually rising. Every Persian attack they repulsed was another proof that they could win this. Warriors who might have been terrified on day one were now veterans of day two. They knew what to expect. They knew they could handle it. Fear was being replaced by grim confidence. Around afternoon, Xerxes made a decision that shows you how desperate he was getting. He sent the immortals back in, again. The elite guard that had been humiliated yesterday was ordered to try again today. Now think about this from the immortals' perspective. These are proud warriors, the best in the Persian army. Yesterday they failed. That's not supposed to happen. So today they've got something to prove. They're going in angry, determined to redeem their reputation. This actually made them more dangerous soldiers. Fighting for honor and redemption are ferocious. The immortals came at the Greek line with everything they had. No fancy tactics, just brutal, sustained pressure. They pressed the attack for hours, and for the first time the Greek line showed signs of strain. The fighting became hand-to-hand. Greeks were pulled over the wall, Persians made it over the wall into Greek positions. The battle devolved into the kind of grinding chaos where training and equipment mattered less than sheer will to survive. This was the crisis point of day two. If the Greeks broke here, the battle was over. Thermopylae would fall. The Persian army would pour into southern Greece. Everything would have been for nothing. Leonidas moved to the front. Ancient sources specifically mention this, the Spartan king, 50 years old, fighting alongside his men at the moment of greatest danger. Not commanding from behind, not observing from safety, but standing in the shield wall, spear in hand, holding the line through personal example. This is leadership at its most visceral. When your king is bleeding beside you, when he's taking the same risks and enduring the same horrors, you can't quit. You can't break. Because if this 50-year-old man can stand firm, how can you in the prime of your youth do any less? The Greeks held. Barely, but they held. The immortals were pushed back again, leaving more of their number dead in the pass. The supposedly immortal unit was proving to be very mortal indeed. As the sun began to set on day two, both sides were approaching their limits. The Persians had thrown everything at the Greek position. Multiple waves of different troops, their elite guard twice, endless streams of arrows, every tactic they could think of. Nothing worked. That damn wall those damn Greeks refused to break. The casualty count was staggering. Herodotus claims 20,000 Persian dead across the 3 days, and while we should be skeptical of ancient numbers, even if it's half that, even if it's a quarter of that, we're talking about thousands of men dead in 2 days, for zero strategic gain. For an empire, this was expensive. For morale, this was devastating. Greek casualties remained relatively low, maybe a few hundred wounded, perhaps 50 to 100 killed over 2 days. The defensive advantage was that overwhelming. But here's what the numbers don't show: exhaustion. The Greeks were running on fumes. They'd been fighting nearly non-stop for 2 days. Adrenaline can only carry you so far before your body just starts shutting down. That night, as the armies disengaged once again, Leonidas faced a command decision. Messages had arrived from the fleet at Artemisium. They'd fought the Persian navy to a draw, suffered significant damage, but were still holding. So, the naval part of the strategy was working, but no messages had come from the south about reinforcements. The main armies were still tied up with religious obligations. The Greeks at Thermopylae were on their own for at least a few more days. Could they hold that long? Leonidas believed yes. They'd proven the pass was defensible. They developed a rhythm, a system. As long as the Persians kept attacking the same way, the Greeks could keep defending the same way. But warfare rarely continues predictably. There's always a variable you didn't account for, always a factor that changes the equation, and at Thermopylae that variable was about to appear in the form of a man whose name would become synonymous with betrayal. Somewhere in the Persian camp that night, a local Greek approached Persian commanders with information. His name was Ephialtes, and he knew something that would change everything. There was a path through the mountains, a goat trail that bypassed Thermopylae entirely, a route that could put Persian troops behind the Greek position. For the right price, he'd show them where it was. We need to talk about Ephialtes because his story is more complicated than simple villainy. Ancient sources paint him as a traitor motivated by greed. Herodotus says he hoped for a rich reward from Xerxes. Later traditions claim he was a Melian, a local from the region around Thermopylae, which would explain his knowledge of mountain paths. But here's a question. Was it really betrayal? Remember, there was no unified Greece. Ephialtes wasn't betraying a nation, he was helping one foreign army against another foreign army. From his perspective, the Persians were going to win eventually. They always did. Why not profit from the inevitable? This is the moral complexity of ancient warfare. Our modern concepts of patriotism and treason didn't really apply. City-states made pragmatic decisions based on survival and profit. Individuals did the same. Ephialtes was doing what humans have done throughout history, backing the winning horse and trying to profit from it. That doesn't make him a hero, obviously. The Greeks at Thermopylae were fighting for something larger than their individual city-states. They were fighting for Greek freedom, for the right to not be absorbed into the Persian Empire. Ephialtes' actions would lead to their deaths. There's no spinning that as anything but tragic, but understanding his motivation is important. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man making a calculated decision in a world where neutrality and medieasing were common accepted practices. His choice just happened to have world historical consequences. When Persian commanders heard about this mountain path, they immediately saw the solution to their problem. They couldn't break through the pass from the front, but if they could get troops behind the Greek position, the defensive advantage would evaporate. The Greeks would be caught between two forces and crushed. Xerxes ordered his commander Hydans to take the immortals, yes them again, and march through the night along this mountain path. By dawn they should be descending on the far side of the pass behind the Greek lines. Meanwhile, at first light, the main Persian army would launch another frontal assault. The Greeks would realize they were surrounded, panic and break. It was a good plan. A solid plan. The kind of flanking maneuver that military academies still teach today, and it should have worked perfectly. It didn't, because of one factor the Persians hadn't accounted for. The Greeks knew about the path. They'd posted guards on it. 1,000 Phocian hoplites were stationed up in the mountains specifically to prevent exactly this kind of flanking maneuver, but knowing about the danger and stopping it would prove to be two very different things. Because what happened that night in the mountains above Thermopylae would seal the fate of everyone in the pass below. The betrayal wasn't just that Ephialtes revealed the path, it was that the guard posted to defend it would fail in their mission. And when the sun rose on the third day, when the Greeks in the pass realized they'd been outflanked, Leonidas would face the decision that would define his legacy. Die here defending the pass or live by retreating? For a Spartan king who'd been told by prophecy that his death was required to save his city, that wasn't really a choice at all. The third day was coming, the day of the last stand, the day that would echo through history for 2,500 years, the day that would prove whether all that training, all that sacrifice, all that suffering in the Agog had created men who could face death without flinching. Let's witness what happened when prophecy, duty and courage collided at the Hot Gates. Darkness fell over the mountains above Thermopylae on the night of August 18th, 480 BC. While the main armies below settled into an uneasy sleep tormented by the day's carnage, something was happening in the peaks above them that would change everything. 10,000 Persian immortals were climbing through the darkness led by a Greek traitor who knew every twist and turn of a path the defenders had thought was secured. The mountain was about to speak, and what it said would doom the bravest warriors Greece had ever produced. The path that Ephialtes revealed was called the Outnumbered, a goat trail that wound through the Kallidromos mountains, bypassing Thermopylae entirely. It wasn't a road. It wasn't even a proper path in most places. just a narrow track that shepherds used to move livestock between high pastures worn into the mountainside over generations by hooves and feet. But it was passable, and more importantly, it was unknown to most Greeks except for locals. The Phocians who came from this region knew about it. That's why Leonidas had stationed 1,000 of them up in the mountains with specific orders. Guard this path with your lives. If anyone comes through, stop them. The entire defence of Thermopylae depends on it. The Phocians took their position seriously. They'd set up camp near where the path crested the mountain ridge, the logical place to intercept anyone trying to use it. They posted sentries. They remained vigilant. But vigilance has its limits when you've been sitting on a mountainside for days with nothing happening. Around midnight, Hydarnes led the immortals onto the path. 10,000 men moving in near-complete darkness, trying to be as quiet as an army can be. Can you imagine that march? The psychological tension, one wrong step and you're tumbling down a mountain. The narrow path means you're moving in a long, vulnerable column. If the Greeks discover you if they attack while you're strung out on this trail, you're in serious trouble. But Hydarnes was a skilled commander. He knew the danger. The immortals moved slowly, carefully, feeling their way through the darkness. Ephialtes guided them from the front, pointing out hazards indicating where the path twisted or narrowed. It was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning when they approached the Phocian position. Here's where accounts get a bit fuzzy. We're relying on second-hand reports from survivors and witnesses who weren't actually there. But what seems to have happened is this. The Phocians heard the Persians coming before they saw them. The sound of thousands of feet, no matter how careful, makes noise. Rustling, rocks being dislodged, the inevitable clanking of weapons and armour. The Phocian sentries raised the alarm. Warriors grabbed their weapons and rushed to form a battle line. They took position at what they thought was a defensible spot on the path shields locked ready to hold. And then, nothing happened. The Persians didn't attack the Phocian position. They didn't engage at all. Instead, Hydarnes did something brilliant. He deployed his archers. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Persian bowmen began shooting volleys of arrows at the Phocian position. Not aimed shots, it was too dark for precision. Just mass volleys arcing through the darkness, falling like deadly rain. The Phocians in their heavy armour hunkered behind their shields and endured the barrage. This is what they'd trained for. Hold the line. Weather the assault. Wait for the Persians to charge so they could engage in the kind of close-quarters combat where Greek hoplites dominated. But the charge never came. The Persians just kept shooting, wave after wave of arrows, and slowly they began moving around the Phocian position. Here's the thing about a narrow mountain path. It's not actually narrow everywhere. There are sections where it widens, where the terrain opens up enough for troops to maneuver. And the immortals, professional soldiers, with experience fighting in mountainous terrain, knew how to use this. While keeping the Phocians pinned down with archery, Persian units moved off the main path, scrambling over rocks and through brush to outflank the Greek position. The Phocians suddenly realized they were about to be surrounded, and in that moment they faced a terrible choice: stand and fight, probably die, and maybe stop or delay the Persians, or retreat to a higher position, regroup and try to hold a better defensive line. They chose retreat. They fell back to higher ground, and in doing so they left the path open. Now, before we judge them too harshly, put yourself in their position. You're on a mountain in near total darkness. You can't see how many enemies you're facing, you just hear thousands of feet, and see arrows falling like rain. You're being outflanked. Your orders were to guard the path, but if you die here without inflicting significant casualties, you failed anyway. Retreating to a better position seems like the tactically sound choice. But it meant the Persians got through. Hydarnes didn't even bother finishing the fight. He left the Phocians on their hilltop and kept moving. Every minute counted. The goal wasn't to defeat these guards, it was to get behind the Greek position at Thermopylae before dawn. The immortals pressed on through the remaining darkness, descending the far side of the mountain range. As the first grey light of pre-dawn appeared in the east, they reached the foothills. Below them they could see the coastal plain. In the distance, the Greek camp. The rear of the Greek position at Thermopylae was now exposed. Meanwhile, down in the pass, the Greeks had no idea what was happening. They'd fought exhaustingly for 2 days. They'd held. They were preparing for what they assumed would be another day of the same brutal defensive fighting. Victory seemed possible, difficult, costly, but possible. Then the Phocian scouts came running down from the mountains. Picture this moment. You're Leonidas catching maybe a few hours of sleep after 2 days of constant combat. Someone shakes you awake. So the Phocians failed. The Persians got through the mountain pass. They're behind us. Everything just changed. The entire strategic situation just collapsed. The defensive position that made Thermopylae unbreakable, worthless now. The narrow pass that neutralized Persian numbers, irrelevant. You're about to be caught between two armies and crushed like a walnut in a vice. Leonidas called an immediate council of war. The Allied commanders gathered in the grey pre-dawn light, and they faced the hardest military decision imaginable. What do we do? The tactical situation was clear. If they stayed, they'd be surrounded and destroyed. The Persian main army would attack from the front while the immortals hit them from behind. No defensive advantage, no clever terrain, just annihilation. If they retreated immediately right now, they could probably get most of the army out before the immortals descended from the mountains, live to fight another day. The debate that followed is one of history's great moments, and we only know fragments of it from ancient sources. But what seems to have happened is this: Leonidas ordered most of the Allied contingents to retreat immediately. The Corinthians, the Arcadians, the various smaller city-state forces, go! Get out of here! Fall back to the isthmus and prepare the next defensive line. Your deaths here won't change the outcome. Some left immediately grateful for the chance to survive. Others hesitated, torn between survival instinct and the shame of abandoning the position. But eventually most began the retreat south, marching hard to put distance between themselves and the coming catastrophe. But not everyone left. The 300 Spartans remained. Leonidas wouldn't order them to retreat, and even if he had, they wouldn't have obeyed. Remember the oracle's prophecy: Sparta would either lose its city or lose a king from the line of Heracles. Leonidas had known from the beginning that he was going to die here. This was his destiny. This was his duty. The 700 Thespians also stayed. Their commander Demophilus refused to retreat. Think about that. These weren't Spartans with their legendary warrior culture and death before dishonor code. These were regular Greek citizens from a small city-state called Thespior. They could have left. Nobody would have blamed them. But when given the choice between survival and standing with the Spartans, they chose honor. 700 Thespians. Their sacrifice is often forgotten in the legend of the 300 Spartans, but it shouldn't be. These were men choosing certain death not because their culture demanded it, but because it was the right thing to do. That's a different, perhaps even more profound kind of courage. The 400 Thebans presented a more complicated situation. Ancient sources differ on whether they stayed willingly or were forced to remain. Herodotus suggests some Thebans wanted Medes to defect to the Persians, and Leonidas kept them as hostages to prevent that. Other sources claim they stayed voluntarily. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Thebes was politically divided with pro-Persian and pro-Greek factions. The Thebans at Thermopylae probably reflected that division. So as dawn broke on the third day, August 19th, 480 BC, approximately 1,400 men remained at Thermopylae: 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, plus the helots and servants who refused to abandon their Spartan masters. They knew they were going to die. They knew the strategic position was lost. But they were going to make the Persians pay for every inch of ground. Why? Why make a last stand when it was tactically pointless? The pass had already been turned. The defensive advantage was gone. These men were going to die without changing the ultimate outcome. But here's the thing, they were buying time. Every hour they held was an hour the retreating Greek forces had to get away. Every minute they fought was another minute for southern Greece to prepare its defences. Their deaths would be tactically meaningless, but strategically crucial. And beyond tactics and strategy, there was something else. Something harder to quantify, but just as important: the message they were sending. To Greece, they were proving that resistance was possible, that Persian victory wasn't inevitable, that some men would rather die free than live as subjects of an empire. To Persia, they were demonstrating that conquering Greece would cost more blood than Xerxes had imagined. Sometimes the value of a battle isn't measured in territory gained or enemies defeated. Sometimes it's measured in inspiration provided and morale destroyed. As the sun rose over the Malian Gulf, painting the waters gold and illuminating the narrow pass where two empires collided, Leonidas and his remaining warriors prepared for their final stand. They moved forward from the wall, no point defending it now since they'd be attacked from both sides anyway. They advanced to a wider part of the pass, to a small hill where they'd have better visibility and could fight in all directions. They knew what was coming. The scouts reported that the immortals were descending from the mountains. The main Persian army was forming up for assault, Within hours, maybe minutes, they'd be surrounded. But if you're going to die, you might as well take as many enemies with you as possible. You might as well make them remember this day. You might as well show the world what men fighting for something greater than themselves can achieve even in defeat. The Spartans had a saying, "Come back with your shielder on it." These men were about to fulfill the second part of that command. They were going to be carried back to Greece on their shields dead but undefeated in spirit. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. The last stand of the 300 and their allies. The final fight where men with nothing left to lose faced an empire and refused to kneel, where the mountain path betrayal led to the most famous defeat in military history. Let's witness the end of the Battle of Thermopylae not as a tragedy, but as the birth of a legend that would inspire warriors for the next 2,500 years. The sun climbed higher over Thermopylae on that third morning, and with it came a silence that was somehow worse than the chaos of the previous days. No more strategic planning, no more hope of reinforcements, no more illusions about survival. Just 400 men standing in a pass waiting for an empire to come kill them. But if you think that silence was filled with despair, you'd be wrong, because something extraordinary happens when men know they're going to die. Fear disappears, doubt evaporates. All that remains is clarity of purpose and a strange, almost peaceful resolve. The ancient Greeks had a word for this state of mind, aristeia, the moment when a warrior achieves their highest excellence, usually just before death. These men were about to live their aristeia. Before the Persian assault began, Leonidas did something that ancient sources specifically mention because it was so unusual. He ordered his men to eat a full breakfast. Not a quick meal, not combat rations. A proper, leisurely breakfast. Meat if they had it, bread, wine. Sitting down, taking their time. When questioned about this because really shouldn't they be preparing defences or something, Leonidas allegedly replied, "Tonight we dine in Hades?" He was telling his men, "Enjoy this meal because it's your last. We're already dead. We're just waiting for our bodies to catch up with that reality." There's something darkly beautiful about this. No panic. No last-minute scrambling. Just acceptance. Just soldiers sharing one final meal before the end. It's the kind of scene that seems fictional, but multiple ancient sources corroborate it. This actually happened. While the Greeks ate their breakfast, the Persian army prepared for what they assumed would be the final decisive assault. Xerxes had received word that the immortals were in position behind the Greek lines. The trap was set. Now it was just a matter of springing it. But Xerxes made an interesting decision. He waited until mid-morning to attack, or probably to ensure his forces were fully coordinated. Maybe to give the Greeks time to realize their situation was hopeless and surrender. Possibly because he wanted maximum daylight to pursue and destroy any Greeks who tried to flee. The waiting must have been psychologically brutal for the Persians. You can see this enemy is surrounded, trapped, doomed. But they're just sitting there, eating. Some sources say the Spartans were combing their hair again, that ritual preparation for death that had confused Xerxes' scouts before the battle began. It's a power move, a way of saying, "We know we're about to die and we're so unconcerned about you that we're going to make sure we look good for the afterlife." Around mid-morning, the Persian assault began from both directions simultaneously. The main army attacked from the north while the immortals advanced from the south. The Greeks were caught in the vice exactly as planned. But here's where the Greek position on that small hill became important. It wasn't much of a hill, ancient sources call it a kolonos, just a slight rise. But it gave them enough elevation to see attacks coming from multiple directions. And more importantly, it meant the Persians had to attack uphill, which is always harder than attacking on flat ground. The Greeks formed a circular defensive formation, something between a traditional phalanx and an improvised shield wall that could face threats from any direction. This required incredible discipline and coordination. In a normal phalanx, everyone faces the same direction and trusts the men beside them. In a circular formation, you're constantly having to watch your sector, adjust to threats, communicate with the men around you, who are facing different directions. Only soldiers with years of training together could even attempt this. The Spartans made it look routine. The first Persian waves crashed against this circular formation and broke. The Greeks fought with a ferocity that surprised even the Persians who'd faced them the previous 2 days. When you're fighting for survival, you hold something back, some reserve of energy, some hope for tomorrow. When you're fighting with no tomorrow, you have nothing to hold back. You can go all out every moment because what are you saving your strength for? The spears began to break. After 2 days of constant use, after hours of stabbing and blocking and being smashed against shields, the wooden shafts started to splinter and crack. This happens in prolonged combat. Weapons fail. And when your 7-foot spear breaks, you're suddenly at a severe disadvantage against an enemy with working spears. The Greeks switched to their short swords, the xiphos. Now the combat became even more intimate, more brutal. Sword fighting is different from spear fighting. You need to get close, really close. Close enough to smell your enemy's breath, to see the fear in his eyes. Close enough that when you stab him, his blood sprays your face. This is the kind of fighting that breaks most men. But these weren't most men. Ancient sources describe moments from this final battle that border on the superhuman. Spartans fighting with broken weapons, using just their shields as weapons. Men fighting with multiple wounds that should have been fatal, staying on their feet through sheer will until they finally collapsed. Thespians forming tight groups, protecting wounded comrades, refusing to abandon anyone. Leonidas himself fought at the front of this desperate melee. A 50-year-old king who could have commanded from the rear, who could have preserved his dignity by dying, less directly chose instead to fight as an ordinary warrior. Multiple ancient sources mention this specifically. He was there in the press, dealing death until death came for him. And come for him it did. Herodotus tells us that Leonidas fell during the height of the battle. Killed by Persian spears or arrows, accounts differ. The moment the Spartans realized their king was down, something remarkable happened. They launched a furious counterattack to recover his body. You need to understand what this meant in ancient Greek warfare. The body of a fallen king wasn't just a corpse, it was sacred. It represented his honor, his legacy, his connection to the gods. Leaving a king's body on the battlefield for enemies to desecrate was unthinkable. So the Spartans, surrounded and dying, fought their way to where Leonidas had fallen and attempted to carry his body back. The Persians, recognizing the symbolic importance of capturing the Spartan king's corpse, fought just as hard to take it. 4 times the Greeks drove the Persians back and recovered the body. 4 times the Persians counterattacked and nearly took it. This fight within a fight, this battle over one dead man, raged with intensity that surpassed everything that had come before. Eventually the Persians overwhelmed the Greeks through sheer numbers and took Leonidas's body. But those minutes fighting to protect their dead king said everything about Spartan values. Duty didn't end with death. Honor required protecting even the dead. With Leonidas' fallen command passed to the remaining Spartan officers, the situation was becoming impossible. Swords were breaking now too. The circular formation was collapsing. The Persians were pressing from all sides. The Greeks pulled back to the narrowest part of the hill, compressing into a tighter and tighter defensive cluster. Here's where the ancient accounts become most poignant. When the Greek swords broke, they fought with their hands. When they were too wounded to stand, they fought from their knees. Ancient sources describe men literally fighting with their teeth, biting Persian soldiers when they had no other weapons left. This isn't Hollywood heroics. This is what happens when men conditioned from age 7 to never surrender, never retreat, never show weakness, face death. The body fails, but the mind refuses to accept defeat. So you keep fighting with whatever you have left until there's nothing left at all. The Persians, frustrated by the Greeks' refusal to just die, already pulled back and began using arrows. From a distance, thousands of Persian archers fired volley after volley into the remaining Greek defenders. There's a famous story, probably apocryphal, but it captures the spirit about a Spartan warrior who was told that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block out the sun. His response, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." Whether that exchange actually happened or not, the archer volleys were real. Wave after wave of arrows falling on men who had nowhere to hide, no shields left intact, nothing but their bodies and their determination. One by one they fell. The Thespians died beside the Spartans, honouring their oath to stand until the end. The Helots who'd refused to abandon their masters died, protecting men who technically owned them as slaves. The Thebans present a more complex ending. According to Herodotus, when the situation became truly hopeless, many Thebans broke away and attempted to surrender. They raised their hands, threw down their weapons, and approached the Persians, asking for mercy. Some were accepted as captives. Others were killed despite surrendering. Herodotus says many were branded with the Persian royal mark, treated as traitors, who'd fought too well before switching sides. Modern historians debate how much of this Theban betrayal narrative is true, and how much is later Athenian propaganda against Thebes, which did eventually Medes after Thermopylae. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some Thebans likely fought to the end. Some probably attempted surrender. War is messy, and not everyone facing death behaves heroically. By midday it was over. The last defenders had fallen. The Persians finally controlled the pass. Bodies lay everywhere, Greek and Persian alike, though Persian casualties far outnumbered Greek. The narrow pass had become a charnel house, the ground soaked with blood, the air thick with the smell of death. Xerxes, touring the battlefield afterward, allegedly asked to see Leonidas's body. When it was brought before him, he ordered it decapitated and the head mounted on a stake. Some sources say he also ordered the body crucified hung up as a warning. This was unusual. Persian culture typically treated brave enemies with respect, giving them proper burials. But Xerxes was furious. This tiny Greek force had cost him thousands of men, delayed his invasion by 3 days, and damaged his army's morale. He wanted revenge even on a corpse. But here's the thing, by desecrating Leonidas's body, Xerxes turned a defeated enemy into a martyr. He made the Spartan king's sacrifice even more powerful. Greeks throughout the peninsula heard about this treatment and were outraged. It didn't intimidate them, it inspired them to fight harder. Herodotus reports that of the Greek defenders, only about half a dozen Spartans survived men who'd been too ill to fight, or who'd been sent as messengers before the final battle. When these survivors returned to Sparta, they faced social disgrace. They'd lived while their comrades died. In Spartan culture, this was nearly as bad as cowardice. One of them, a warrior named Aristodemus, had been sent away before the battle due to an eye infection. He returned to such shame that the only way to restore his honour was to fight with suicidal bravery at the Battle of Plataea the following year, where he finally earned redemption by dying heroically. Think about that for a moment. Surviving when your comrades died was considered shameful. The only acceptable way to restore honour was to go get yourself killed in the next battle. That's the Spartan mindset in its purest, most extreme form. The aftermath of Thermopylae sent shockwaves through both empires. For Persia, the victory was hollow. Yes, they'd taken the pass. Yes, they'd killed the defenders. But at what cost thousands dead for a narrow piece of ground? And if this is what it cost to defeat 400 Greeks in favourable terrain, what would it cost to conquer the rest of Greece? For Greece, the defeat became a rallying cry. The sacrifice at Thermopylae proved that Persians could be hurt, could bleed, could be stopped even if only temporarily. The 3-day delay gave Athens time to evacuate its population. The Greek fleet at Artemisium, hearing of Thermopylae's fall, retreated to Salamis and prepared for the naval battle that would determine Greece's fate. In the immediate aftermath, Xerxes' army marched south virtually unopposed. They burned Athens' captured central Greece seemed unstoppable. But the momentum from Thermopylae was gone. The aura of invincibility had been shattered, and within weeks the Greek fleet would destroy the Persian navy at Salamis, forcing Xerxes to retreat and leaving his army isolated in hostile territory. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we see how Thermopylae's sacrifice ultimately led to Greek victory, we need to understand what happened in those crucial weeks after the battle. How did Greece respond to this devastating loss? How did they transform a tactical defeat into strategic advantage? And how did the legend of the 300 begin to grow even before the war was over? That's where we're heading next, to witness how sacrifice becomes legend, and how a battle lost in blood becomes a victory of the spirit that echoes through millennia. Victory has a strange taste when it cost you everything you expected it to be worth. Xerxes stood at Thermopylae holding a pass he'd won, surrounded by thousands of his dead soldiers, staring at the corpse of an enemy king who'd somehow turned defeat into defiance. The path south lay open. The invasion could continue. He'd won the battle. So why did it feel like he'd lost something far more valuable? News of Thermopylae's fall spread across Greece like wildfire. But here's what's fascinating. It didn't break Greek morale. It ignited it. The message that reached Athens, Corinth, Sparta, and every other city wasn't, "We've lost." It was, they held for 3 days. 300 Spartans and their allies stood against an empire and bled it dry. If they could do that, imagine what all of Greece united could achieve. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had bought something more precious than time. It had bought belief. Belief that the Persians weren't invincible. Belief that Greek courage and Greek tactics could prevail against impossible odds. Belief that resistance wasn't futile, it was possible. But belief doesn't win wars by itself. The Greeks still faced a catastrophic strategic situation. Let's look at exactly how bad things were in late August 480 BC. Thermopylae had fallen. The northern defensive line was shattered. Central Greece, including Boeotia and Phocis, was now wide open to Persian occupation. The Greek fleet at Artemisium, after 3 days of brutal naval combat that coincided with the land battle, had retreated to Salamis. They'd fought the Persian navy to essentially a draw, inflicting heavy casualties, but suffering heavy losses themselves. Neither navy had decisively won, but the fall of Thermopylae meant the Greek fleet couldn't stay in northern waters. They had to pull back or risk being cut off. Xerxes' army marched south essentially unopposed. Cities surrendered as the Persians approached. The ones that didn't surrender were destroyed. Phocis, whose guards had failed to hold the mountain path, suffered particularly harsh treatment. Xerxes ordered systematic destruction of Phocian cities as punishment. Villages were burned, temples were looted. The population was either enslaved or fled ahead of the advancing army. By early September, the Persians reached Athens, and Athens was empty, completely empty. This was Themistocles' doing, and it was one of the most audacious civilian evacuations in ancient history. Remember the oracle's prophecy about wooden walls saving Athens? Themistocles had convinced the Athenians that it referred to their fleet, not the city walls. Therefore, the strategy was to abandon Athens, entirely evacuate everyone to the island of Salamis and the nearby Peloponnese, and bet everything on a naval battle. Think about what he was asking. Abandon your city. Abandon your homes. Leave behind everything you can't carry. Trust that our fleet will save us, because if it doesn't, we have nothing left. No city to return to. No home. Nothing. And the Athenians did it. Tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, children, elderly, sick, were evacuated in a matter of days. They loaded onto ships and sailed to Salamis, leaving Athens to the Persians. It was heartbreaking. It was terrifying, but it was necessary. When Xerxes entered Athens in early September 480 BC, he found a ghost city. No defenders, no population, just empty buildings. In his frustration and fury, he ordered Athens burned. The Acropolis was torched. Temples were destroyed, including the old temple of Athena, the patron goddess of the city. The destruction was thorough and deliberate. He wanted to punish Athens for daring to defy Persia, for supporting the Ionian revolt for Marathon. From a hillside on Salamis, the Athenian refugees watched their city burn. Can you imagine that watching smoke rise from your home, knowing everything you owned was turning to ash, wondering if you'd ever return? The psychological trauma must have been immense, but here's what the Persians hadn't counted on. The Greeks weren't broken. If anything, burning Athens hardened Greek resolve. You can't go home now. You can't negotiate. You can't surrender and hope for mercy. The only path forward is through victory, because defeat means you have nothing. Xerxes now faced a strategic dilemma of his own. He'd conquered northern and central Greece. He'd burned Athens. His army controlled everything north of the Isthmus of Corinth, where the remaining Greek army was fortifying a defensive wall. But he hadn't defeated the Greek military. Their army was intact, their fleet was intact and positioned at Salamis, and winter was coming. This is the logistics problem nobody talks about enough. Xerxes had maybe 200,000 men to feed, every day, in a land that was now hostile and whose crops had been burned or hidden. Supply lines stretched all the way back to Asia Minor, vulnerable to raids and weather. His fleet had suffered significant damage at Artemisium and needed repairs. His army was exhausted from months of campaigning. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it soon. Otherwise, he'd have to withdraw for the winter, and returning the next year would mean starting the whole invasion over again, but with a diminished reputation and shaky alliances. The Greek fleet at Salamis was the key. If Xerxes could destroy it, the war was essentially over. The Greek army would be isolated, could be starved out or bypassed. Without naval support, the Peloponnesian cities couldn't hold. But if the Greek fleet survived and won, if they destroyed the Persian navy, then Xerxes' army would be stranded in Greece, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, vulnerable to guerrilla warfare and attrition. Everything hinged on what happened at Salamis. The Greek commanders gathered on the island were arguing furiously about strategy. The Peloponnesian contingents wanted to retreat to the isthmus, abandon Salamis and Athens, and defend only their home territories. The Athenians obviously opposed this. They'd already lost their city. They weren't going to abandon their fleet too. Themistocles argued passionately that fighting at Salamis offered the best tactical advantage. The narrow straits would neutralize Persian numerical superiority, just like Thermopylae had done on land. The debate was getting heated. Unity was fracturing again. Some commanders were literally preparing to sail away. And here's where Themistocles pulled off one of history's greatest strategic deceptions. He secretly sent a message to Xerxes. A slave carried it. His name was Sisinus according to Herodotus, and the message said essentially, "The Greeks are planning to retreat tonight. If you attack now, you can trap them. They're disorganized and scared. Easy victory." This was a complete lie, but Xerxes believed it. Why wouldn't he? A Greek slave offering to betray his masters for Persian gold fit the pattern Xerxes had seen throughout the campaign. He'd bought plenty of Greeks with bribes. Why not one more? So Xerxes ordered his fleet to move into position overnight surrounding the Greek position at Salamis, blocking the escape routes. He was setting a trap or so, he thought. In reality, Themistocles had trapped him. By forcing the Persian fleet into the narrow straits, he'd created exactly the tactical situation the Greeks needed. The Persians had no choice now but to fight in confined waters where their superior numbers meant nothing. On September 20th, 180 BC, less than a month after Thermopylae, the Battle of Salamis began. Xerxes had a golden throne set up on a hillside overlooking the strait, so he could watch his fleet's glorious victory. He was about to witness something very different. The Greek triremes, those wooden walls the oracle had promised, proved devastatingly effective in the narrow waters. They were more maneuverable than Persian ships. Greek crews were better trained for close-quarters naval combat. The Athenian marines were fighting for their homes, their families, their survival. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. The battle was chaos. Ships ramming each other, bronze-beaked prows punching holes in wooden hulls, marines boarding enemy vessels for hand-to-hand combat on heaving decks, arrows flying, men drowning in armour, ships capsizing, fire spreading from vessel to vessel. The narrow strait became a killing ground, and the Persian fleet was slaughtered. Ancient sources claim the Persians lost 200 ships or more. The Greeks lost maybe 40. Even accounting for exaggeration, it was a decisive victory. The Persian fleet was shattered. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne, saw his navy, the key to his entire invasion strategy, destroyed in a single day. And he made a decision that changed everything. He retreated. Not the whole army, but he personally withdrew with a large portion of his forces back to Asia. Ancient sources suggest he feared the Greeks might sail to the Hellespont and destroy the bridges trapping him in Europe. More likely he realized that without naval superiority holding Greece through the winter was impossible. Supply lines were too vulnerable. The strategic situation had collapsed. He left behind his general Mardonius with maybe 100,000 troops to continue the campaign. But the momentum was gone, the aura of invincibility was shattered, and the Greeks, energized by their victory at Salamis, began to push back. Over the winter of 480-479 BC, both sides prepared for the final confrontation. Mardonius tried diplomacy, offering Athens incredibly generous terms if they'd switch sides, autonomy territory, rebuilding assistance. Athens refused. The memory of their burning city, the sacrifice at Thermopylae, the victory at Salamis, these had forged a determination that couldn't be bought. In the summer of 479 BC, the largest Greek army ever assembled, maybe 70,000 to 100,000 hoplites, from dozens of city-states marched north to face Mardonius. The Spartans sent their full army, no longer constrained by religious festivals. The Athenians contributed thousands. City-states that had medised after Thermopylae switched sides again, seeing which way the wind was blowing. The two armies met at Plataea in Boeotia. The battle was enormous, sprawling, chaotic, everything Thermopylae wasn't. It lasted for days with multiple engagements. Persian cavalry wreaked havoc on Greek supply lines. Greek hoplites struggled to maintain formation on uneven terrain. It was a near-run thing with the outcome in doubt until the final hours. But ultimately Greek discipline and the phalanx proved decisive. Mardonius was killed in the fighting. His death broke Persian morale. The army retreated in disorder, and the Greeks pursued, killing thousands. The remainder of the Persian army withdrew from Greece entirely, never to return. On the same day, according to legend though, the timing was probably coincidence, the Greek fleet destroyed the remaining Persian ships at the Battle of Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. In a single day, the Greeks won decisive victories on both land and sea. The invasion was over. Persia had lost. Xerxes' grand campaign had ended in catastrophic failure. He'd lost his fleet, lost his army, lost tens of thousands of men and gained nothing. The empire was humiliated. Xerxes himself would be assassinated by his own bodyguard 15 years later, in 465 BC. His dream of conquering Europe died at Salamis and Plataea. For Greece, victory was transformative. Athens would use its naval power to build an empire of its own, the Delian League, that would eventually rival Sparta. The confidence gained from defeating Persia would fuel the golden age of Athens, the age of Pericles, of democracy, of Socrates and Plato, of the Parthenon, and Greek drama. Western philosophy, science, democracy, art. So much of what we consider Western civilization's foundation flourished in the century after the Persian Wars. But none of this would have been possible without those 3 days at Thermopylae. The sacrifice there bought time, certainly. But more than that, it bought belief. It proved that Greeks could stand against the greatest empire on earth and not break. It created a legend that would inspire Greek warriors at Salamis and Plataea. It turned a defensive battle into a symbol that transcended military strategy. The victory was Persia's at Thermopylae. But the war's outcome was decided by the men who died there. Their sacrifice made Salamis possible, which made Plataea possible, which saved Greece, which preserved the culture that would shape Western civilization for the next 2,500 years. Not bad for just 400 men who knew they were going to die, but chose to stand anyway. Now we need to talk about what happened after the dust settled, after the wars ended, after the immediate crisis passed. Because the Battle of Thermopylae didn't end when the fighting stopped. Its legend was just beginning. The story of the 300 would be told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until it became something larger than the historical event itself. How does a military defeat become one of history's most celebrated last stands? How did Leonidas and his warriors become symbols that transcend their own time and place? And what does the legend of Thermopylae tell us about what we value, what we honor, what we choose to remember across millennia? That's where we're heading next, into the legend itself, and the eternal questions it raises about courage, sacrifice, and the stories we tell about heroes. History and legend are strange bedfellows. History tells us what happened. Legend tells us what it meant. And sometimes the legend becomes more powerful than the history it's based on. Sometimes a story transcends facts and becomes something eternal, a mirror in which every generation sees its own values reflected back. The story of Thermopylae became that kind of legend almost immediately, and understanding how a military defeat transformed into Western civilization's most celebrated last stand tells us as much about ourselves as it does about ancient Greece. The legend began even before the battle was over. When Leonidas chose to stay and die, he knew he was creating a story. Spartans understood the power of narrative. They'd built their entire culture on stories of heroic ancestors, of warriors who never surrendered, of men who chose death over dishonor. Leonidas wasn't just fighting a military battle. He was writing the final chapter of his people's greatest story, and he made sure that story would be told. Before the last stand, he sent messengers south with detailed accounts of what had happened. He wanted Greece to know exactly what the Spartans and their allies had done. He wanted the sacrifice to matter. He wanted it remembered. Within days of the battle's end, the story was spreading across Greece. But here's what's fascinating. The story that spread wasn't about defeat. It was about defiance. The narrative wasn't, "We lost Thermopylae," but rather 300 Spartans held the pass for 3 days against millions. The numbers were already being exaggerated. Herodotus, writing just 40 years later, claimed Xerxes had 5 million men, but the exaggeration served the legend. The more impossible the odds, the more incredible the courage. The Spartans erected a stone monument at Thermopylae almost immediately after the war ended. It's still there, by the way, or at least a later reconstruction of it is. The inscription is one of the most famous epitaphs in history. Written by the poet Simonides of Chios, it reads, "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that here we lie obedient to their commands." That's it. 21 words in Greek, no boasting, no elaborate praise, just a simple statement. We did our duty, we obeyed orders, we're dead now. Tell them. The economy of language is perfectly Spartan, remember laconophrasia, the art of speaking briefly, but the emotional weight is staggering. These men followed orders that they knew would kill them. They did it anyway. And they want you, the stranger passing by, to carry that message home. This epitaph has been quoted for 2,500 years. It's been translated into dozens of languages. It appears on memorials for fallen soldiers across the world. Why? Because it captures something universal about military sacrifice. The idea that duty matters more than life. That obedience to a cause greater than yourself is the highest form of honor. But the legend didn't stay simple. As centuries passed, the story of Thermopylae grew and evolved, taking on new meanings for new audiences. The ancient Greeks themselves used Thermopylae as a moral lesson. The playwright Aeschylus, who'd actually fought at Marathon and Salamis, wrote about the Persian Wars. While his play, The Persians, focuses mainly on the Battle of Salamis, the memory of Thermopylae permeates Greek literature of the period. It became shorthand for Greek superiority, not just military superiority, but moral and cultural superiority. The story implied we Greeks value freedom and courage. The Persians are slaves to a tyrant. That's why we won, even when we lost. Herodotus, writing his histories in the 440s, 430s BC, gave us the most detailed account of the battle. But even he, despite being a relatively careful historian, couldn't resist embellishing certain details. The conversations he records, like Leonidas saying, "Tonight we dine in Hades," probably didn't happen exactly as he describes. He wasn't there, his sources weren't there. But these dramatizations served the legend, and Herodotus understood that history is partly about facts, and partly about meaning. Later Greek writers added even more. Plutarch, writing in the 1st-2nd century AD, 600 years after the battle, includes numerous anecdotes about Spartan courage at Thermopylae in his Sayings of Spartans. Some of these are probably true. Many are probably inventions designed to illustrate Spartan values. But by Plutarch's time, the distinction between history and legend had blurred. Thermopylae had become a parable. When Rome conquered Greece, the Romans adopted the legend as their own. Roman writers like Cicero referenced Thermopylae as an example of military virtue. Roman soldiers were taught about the battle as part of their training. The idea of the heroic last stand became central to Roman military culture. Think of the stories about Roman legions fighting to the last man against barbarian hordes. These narratives were consciously modelled on Thermopylae. Then Christianity transformed the legend again. Early Christian martyrs facing death in Roman arenas were compared to the Spartans at Thermopylae, warriors for faith rather than country, but exhibiting the same courage in the face of certain death. The epitaph, "We lie here obedient to their commands," took on religious overtones. Obedience to God's will became the Christian equivalent of obedience to Sparta's laws. During the Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered classical texts, Thermopylae became a symbol of Western civilization's birth. The battle was portrayed as the moment when Western values democracy, freedom, rational thought survived against Eastern despotism and barbarism. Never mind that Sparta was an oligarchy, not a democracy, and that calling the sophisticated Persian Empire barbaric is absurdly Eurocentric. The legend served a political purpose, defining the West against the East, freedom against tyranny. In more recent history, Thermopylae has been appropriated by nearly every political movement imaginable. Revolutionary movements cite it as proof that small groups of dedicated fighters can resist overwhelming power. Nationalist movements use it to inspire patriotic sacrifice. Military academies around the world teach it as a lesson in tactical defense and leadership by example. And yes, unfortunately, even the Nazis used it. During World War II, Nazi propaganda compared German soldiers to the Spartans, portraying them as defenders of Western civilization against Eastern hordes. This is deeply ironic and horrifying, given that the Nazis' ideology was the antithesis of everything the Greeks actually valued. But legends are malleable. They can be twisted to serve almost any agenda. The story experienced another surge in popular consciousness in 1962 when the film The 300 Spartans was released, and then again in 2006 with Zack Snyder's stylized film 300. These movies took massive liberties with history. The graphic novel 300 by Frank Miller, on which Snyder's film was based, is explicitly fantasy, not history. The Persians in that film are portrayed as monsters, literal monsters in some cases, which is offensive and ahistorical. But here's the interesting thing. These modern adaptations reveal what contemporary audiences value. The 1962 film made during the Cold War portrayed Thermopylae as a battle between freedom-loving Greeks and totalitarian Persians, a not-so-subtle metaphor for Western democracy versus Soviet communism. The 2006 film, made after 9/11, has undertones of Western civilization defending itself against Eastern aggression. Both films say more about the era they were made in than about ancient Greece. So with all this mythology, all these adaptations and appropriations, what's the actual truth about Thermopylae? What should we remember and what should we be skeptical of first? The numbers. Were there really only 300 Spartans? Yes. The Spartiates' full citizen warriors numbered exactly 300 at Thermopylae, But focusing only on them erases the 700 Thespians who stayed and died, the Helots, who fought beside their masters, the other Greeks who participated. The 300 narrative, while technically accurate for Spartans specifically, creates a misleading impression of the battle's participants. Second the odds? Did they really face millions? Number modern estimates put Xerxes' army at 200,000, 300,000, maximum not 5 million. Still overwhelming, still impossible odds, but not quite the mythological numbers ancient sources claimed. Does this diminish the sacrifice? Not at all. Fighting 200,000 with 7,000 is still suicidally brave. Third, the motivation. Were they fighting for freedom and democracy? That's complicated. Sparta was fighting to preserve its way of life, which included massive slavery and an oligarchic government. Athens was fighting to preserve its democracy. The allied Greeks were fighting to avoid being absorbed into an empire. These are all legitimate reasons to fight, but freedom, as we understand it today, is a simplification. Fourth, the outcome. Did Thermopylae save Greece indirectly? Yes. The 3-day delay helped the damage to Persian morale, helped the inspiration to Greek resistance, helped. But Thermopylae alone didn't save Greece Salamis, and Plataea did. The legend tends to overemphasize Thermopylae's direct military impact, while underemphasizing its psychological and symbolic impact. But here's what the legend gets right. The courage was real. The sacrifice was real. The strategic thinking was real. The decision to stand when retreat was possible, that was real. And the impact on Greek morale, the way this battle inspired subsequent victories, that was absolutely real. The power of the Thermopylae legend lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its emotional truth. It captures something fundamental about human courage, the ability to face death for a cause you believe in. It honors sacrifice in a way that resonates across cultures and centuries. It asks a question that every generation must answer. What would you die for? You don't have to be Spartan to be moved by that question. You don't have to believe in military glory or nationalist ideology. The question is universal, and that's why the story endures. In every age, people facing their own challenges have looked back to Thermopylae and found inspiration. Not because ancient Greeks were superior to modern people, but because courage and sacrifice are timeless. The specifics change the enemy, the cause, the context, but the core truth remains. Sometimes standing firm matters more than survival. Sometimes the witness of courage is worth more than tactical victory. The monument at Thermopylae still stands today. Well, a reconstruction of it. The original pass has changed dramatically. Geological shifts and sediment deposits mean the sea is now several miles away from where the Greeks fought. The narrow pass is now a wide plain. If you visit, you'll have to use your imagination to see what the ancient landscape looked like. But the epitaph is still there. Stranger, go tell the Spartans. And people still stop to read it, still take photos, still feel that connection to men who died 2,500 years ago fighting for their idea of what mattered. In 2021, Greece issued commemorative coins for the 2,500th anniversary of the battle. Museums around the world feature exhibits about Thermopylae. Historians continue to write books analysing every aspect of the battle. Popular culture continues to reference it in movies, books, video games, memes. Why? Because the legend of Thermopylae has become part of our collective human story. It's become a shorthand for courage against impossible odds. It's become a way of talking about sacrifice and duty and standing firm when everything tells you to run. Every culture has these legend stories that transcend their historical origins to become moral lessons. The Battle of Thermopylae is one of Western civilization's core legends, sitting alongside stories like the Alamo, the Battle of Britain, the 47 Ronin. These stories aren't just history, they're mythology. And mythology in the best sense teaches us what we value and who we aspire to be. So what should we take from the legend of Thermopylae? What lessons are actually worth carrying forward into our own time? That's the question we're going to explore in our final section, the practical applicable modern lessons from an ancient battle. What does Thermopylae teach us about leadership, about strategy, about courage, about sacrifice? What mistakes were made that we can learn from? And perhaps most importantly, what does this story tell us about ourselves and what we choose to honour? Let's bring this 2,500-year-old story home to the present and discover why it still matters today. 25 centuries. That's how long the Battle of Thermopylae has been teaching us lessons. And the remarkable thing, the lessons keep changing based on what each generation needs to learn. But beneath all the interpretations, beneath all the mythology and appropriation, there are some timeless truths about leadership strategy, courage, and the human spirit that speak to us just as powerfully today as they did in 480 BC. Let's talk about what Thermopylae really teaches us, not the simplified Hollywood version, but the complex, nuanced, deeply human lessons from those 3 days at the Hot Gates. Lesson 1. Terrain and strategy can overcome superior numbers. This is the most obvious military lesson, but it's worth stating clearly: geography matters. Force multipliers matter. You don't need to match your enemy soldier for soldier if you can find a battleground that neutralizes their advantages. Think about modern applications. In business, this is called finding your niche, the narrow market space, where your small company can compete against giants. In politics, it's about choosing the battles you can win rather than fighting on every front. In life, it's about recognizing where your strengths lie and positioning yourself accordingly. The Greeks didn't try to match Persia's army in open field battle; they would have been massacred. Instead, they found a place where Persian numbers meant nothing. They turned geography into an ally. That's not cowardice or cheating, that's brilliant strategic thinking. Modern military academies still teach Thermopylae as a masterclass in defensive warfare. The US Military Academy at West Point analyses it. The British Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst studies it. Why? Because the principle is eternal. When you're outnumbered, make the fight happen on your terms, not theirs. But here's the deeper lesson. Choosing the right battlefield only matters if you have the discipline to hold it. Which brings us to Lesson 2. Training and discipline trump raw talent. The Spartans weren't superheroes. They were humans with the same physical limitations as everyone else. What made them different was training, brutal, lifelong, all-consuming training that turned ordinary men into a coordinated fighting machine. The Agog system was extreme, probably too extreme by modern standards. We shouldn't romanticize child soldiers or brutal education systems, but the underlying principle is valid. Excellence requires practice. Mastery requires repetition. Teamwork requires training together until coordination becomes instinctive. Think about any elite unit today: Navy SEALs, Olympic teams, surgical units, firefighters. What do they have in common? Relentless training. Practice under pressure. Building muscle memory so that when the critical moment comes, you don't have to think, you just execute. The feigned retreat tactic the Spartans used at Thermopylae. That's not something you improvise in battle. You practice it hundreds of times until every soldier knows exactly what to do. That's why it worked repeatedly while the Persians kept falling for it. Training creates options that untrained forces simply don't have. In your own life, whatever field you're in, this lesson applies. You can't rely on talent or inspiration when pressure hits. You need prepared responses, practice skills, ingrained habits. The time to prepare for crisis is before the crisis arrives. Lesson 3. Leadership means sharing the danger. Leonidas was 50 years old. He was a king. He could have commanded from the rear, could have delegated the dangerous work to younger men. Instead, he fought in the front rank. He bled with his soldiers. He died with them. That's leadership. Not the title, not the authority, but the willingness to share the worst of what you're asking others to endure. Modern research on military leadership consistently shows this. Soldiers will follow officers who share their risks. Companies perform better under executives who understand the ground-level challenges. Movements coalesce around leaders who actually practice what they preach. When Leonidas stood in that shield wall on day 2, when the line was breaking and everything hung in the balance, his presence there wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. This applies beyond warfare. In business, sometimes success means staying solvent long enough for market conditions to improve. In personal challenges, sometimes victory means getting through today so you can fight again tomorrow. In social movements, sometimes progress means holding the line against regression until support builds. The Greeks at Thermopylae weren't stupid. They knew they'd probably die. But they also knew that their death served a larger strategy. They trusted that their sacrifice would matter, that it would buy time for the victories to come. That requires a level of strategic thinking that sees beyond immediate outcomes. It requires faith that your contribution, even if it doesn't produce immediate victory, is part of a longer arc towards success. Lesson 5. The symbolic value of resistance. Here's perhaps the most important lesson, the one that explains why we're still talking about this battle, 2,500 years later. The act of resistance itself has value. independent of outcome. When the Greeks chose to stand at Thermopylae, they sent a message to both sides. To the Persians, you're not invincible. You will bleed for every inch. This conquest will cost you more than you imagined. To other Greeks, resistance is possible. Someone is willing to fight. You're not alone. That message reverberated through the entire war. It inspired the Greek fleet at Salamis. It gave courage to wavering city-states. It created a narrative that transformed a series of defensive battles into a war of Greek survival and identity. In modern terms, think about protest movements, civil rights struggles, environmental activism. Sometimes the immediate battle is lost, the law doesn't change, the policy stays in place, the opposition wins. But the act of standing up, of saying, no, this is wrong and I will resist it, changes the conversation. It inspires others. It makes the next fight easier. Rosa Parks didn't immediately desegregate Alabama when she refused to give up her seat, but her resistance became a catalyst for the movement that eventually did. The first people to march for LGBTQ+ rights didn't immediately win legal protections, but they made it possible for future generations to live more freely. Sometimes resistance is its own victory. Sometimes standing firm even in defeat is the most important thing you can do. Lesson 6. Unity and diversity can achieve the impossible. The Greeks at Thermopylae came from different cities, different political systems, different cultures. Spartans and Athenians had been rivals for decades. The various city-states had different agendas, different priorities, different reasons for being there. But for 3 days they fought as one. The Thespians stood with the Spartans even though their cultures were completely different. The differences didn't disappear, but they were subordinated to a common cause. This is perhaps the most relevant lesson for our own divided times. You don't need to agree on everything to stand together on something important. You don't need to share the same background beliefs or values across the board to unite around a common threat or common goal. The Greek alliance was fragile, temporary, and imperfect. But it was enough. It achieved what none of them could have achieved alone. In our polarized world, where tribal loyalties often trump common purpose, Thermopylae reminds us that cooperation doesn't require uniformity. It just requires recognizing when something bigger than your differences is at stake. Lesson 7. Be wary of simple narratives. Here's a lesson about the legend itself. Be skeptical of stories that are too clean, too simple, too perfectly aligned with someone's agenda. The real Spartans, with all their contradictions, fierce warriors and brutal slaveholders, champions of military excellence and creators of a stagnant society, are more fascinating than the mythological perfect soldiers. The real battle, with its strategic calculations and desperate improvisations and tragic mistakes, is more compelling than the sanitized version. Lesson 8. Know what you're willing to die for. This is the ultimate question Thermopylae asks each of us. What matters enough that you'd sacrifice everything for it? Most of us will never face that choice as literally as Leonidas did. Most of us won't stand in a pass facing an army, making a conscious decision to die. But we all face smaller versions of this question throughout our lives. What principles won't you compromise even when compromise would be easier? What relationships matter enough to fight for even when fighting is hard? What causes would you sacrifice career advancement, social approval, or material comfort to support? The Spartans had an answer to this question built into their culture from age 7. We have to figure it out ourselves. But having an answer, knowing what you stand for, what you won't budge on, what you'd sacrifice for, gives your life direction and meaning. You don't have to be a warrior. You don't have to glorify violence or military service, but you do have to know what you're about. You have to know what your hot gates is, the place you'll stand, the principle you won't abandon, the thing you'll defend even when it costs you. For some people it's family. For others it's creative work or justice or environmental protection or their faith or their community. The specific cause matters less than having one, because people without something worth sacrificing for drift through life pushed by circumstances rather than pulling toward chosen purpose. So here we are at the end of our journey through Thermopylae. We've walked from Xerxes' palace to the narrow pass. We've met the warriors, understood the training, analysed the tactics, witnessed the betrayal, and the final stand. We've seen how military defeat became cultural victory, how history became legend. What does it all mean? I think Thermopylae endures because it asks questions rather than providing answers. It asks what's worth dying for. It asks, can a few determined people really change history? It asks, does courage matter when the outcome is predetermined? It asks, how will you be remembered? These are questions every generation must answer for themselves. The specific challenges change. We're not facing Persian invasions, but the fundamental human dilemmas remain. How do we respond to overwhelming threats? How do we maintain unity when division is easier? How do we find courage when fear is rational? How do we create meaning in sacrifice? The Battle of Thermopylae doesn't give us a simple answer. It gives us something better. An example. Not a perfect example, not a morally uncomplicated example, but a real historical moment when real people made a choice to stand rather than run to fight, rather than submit to die with purpose rather than live without it. And that choice echoes across 25 centuries, reminding each generation that courage is possible, that resistance matters, that sacrifice can have meaning beyond the immediate moment. Whether you're fighting literal battles or metaphorical ones, whether you're standing in a mountain pass or making a difficult choice at your kitchen table, the spirit of Thermopylae offers something valuable. The knowledge that others before you faced impossible odds and chose to stand firm.